3 weeks after my wife's funeral, those I once called family forced me into a suffocating boardroom meeting to seize power. My son-in-law slid the folder across the table, flashing a fake smile. "Sign it, old man. Even your wife before she passed wanted you to accept reality and just retire." I dropped my fountain pen, offering a faint smile. But at that exact moment, the boardroom doors burst open. My attorney strode in, slamming down a DNA analysis envelope that exposed a horrific secret, leaving the traders completely frozen. This story starts quietly, but won't leave you unchanged. Before we continue, I need you to drop a comment. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right, yes or no? Your perspective might be exactly what someone else needs today. Some details are fictionalized for storytelling. What matters most is the lesson at its heart. I sat at the mahogany conference table, staring at the people I once called family, my wife's funeral, barely 3 weeks past. The air conditioning hummed its monotonous tune, but all I heard was my own heartbeat steady, controlled the rhythm of a man trained by 40 years of military service to remain calm when predators circled. Leland Grover, 70 years old, retired brigadier general. That's who I was on paper. In this boardroom surrounded by designer grief and manufactured concern, I was something else entirely prey. Or so they thought. Celeste Vaughn, my daughter 42, sat across from me in a black suit that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage. Her makeup was perfect, no tears. Just cold calculation in eyes that should have been red from crying over the woman who raised her. Celeste had always been beautiful, Vera's cheekbones, my stubborn chin. But beauty without warmth is just another weapon. Beside her sat Preston Vaughn, 44, my son-in-law for 19 years. His expression of concern had been rehearsed so many times, it almost looked genuine. Almost. The slight tension at his jaw gave him away. Preston wore expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask the faint smell of desperation. Or maybe that was just what I wanted to smell. Farah Kemp, 46. Our chief financial officer positioned herself strategically near the presentation screen. She'd worked at Grover Defense Logistics for 12 years, always professional, always precise. At the far end of the table, Ronan Vaughn, 19, scrolled through his phone with the oblivious detachment of a college freshman who had no idea he was the centerpiece of a conspiracy. My grandson, or so the birth certificate claimed. The silence stretched. I let it. Silence is a weapon most people don't know how to wield. They fill it with words, with explanations, with reveals they hadn't intended to make. I'd learned that in interrogation rooms from Seoul to Baghdad. Preston moved first. He always did. The legal documents hit the polished mahogany with a sharp smack that echoed in the quiet boardroom. 3 inches of paper bound in navy leather, the kind of presentation that screamed expensive lawyers and long-term planning. "Dad," Preston said, leaning forward with that practiced expression of filial concern. "We're worried about you. The stress your blood pressure you need rests not corporate warfare." Celeste picked up the script seamlessly. "Sign the documents. Let us carry this burden. You've earned peace." Peace, as if peace could be signed away on legal letterhead. Preston slid the papers closer. "The company goes to Ronan. You can finally step away from all of this." I looked at the gold pen placed beside the documents. Expensive? Probably purchased specifically for this moment. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Golden opportunity, gilded cage, pick your metaphor. Transferring $40 million of defense contracts and manufacturing capability to a 19-year-old who couldn't be bothered to look up from his phone, with Preston as guardian and decision-maker until Ronan turned 30. 11 years of absolute control. They thought a grieving 70-year-old man was an easy target. They forgot who built the empire they were trying to steal. They forgot that brigadier generals don't survive 4 decades of military operations by being soft targets. I picked up the gold pen slowly. Preston's eyes followed the movement. Celeste's breathing quickened slightly, barely perceptible, but I'd spent 42 years watching her breathe first, as an infant in my arms, then as a daughter, who grew into someone I no longer recognized. I raised the pen above the signature line. Preston's rehearsed smile widened. I opened my fingers. The pen clattered onto the mahogany table, the sound sharp and final in the manufactured silence. "No," I said. 1 word, 2 letters. 40 years of military command compressed into a single syllable that carried the weight of absolute refusal. Preston's smile froze, then cracked. "Dad, be reasonable. You're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in weeks, I said. Farah shifted in her chair. The drumming fingers stopped. Celeste's eyes widened, genuine surprise breaking through the practiced mask. Good. Let them feel off balance. Let them understand that the grieving widower they'd been counting on was not the man sitting across from them. You don't understand the opportunity you're refusing, Preston said, his voice hardening around the edges. The concerned son-in-law was slipping away, revealing something colder underneath. Oh, I understand perfectly, I replied. That's when the boardroom doors opened. Heavy mahogany doors swinging wide exactly 3 seconds after my refusal. Timing like that doesn't happen by accident. It happens by military precision and careful planning. Dashiell carried a thick manila envelope. He didn't smile, didn't speak, just walked directly to the conference table with the measured pace of a man who had orchestrated this moment down to the second. He slid the envelope across the polished wood. It stopped directly in front of Preston. It certified DNA analysis, printed across the seal in official block letters. Preston stared at the envelope like it was a live grenade. What is this? What was in that envelope? What truth had I uncovered that required federal agents as witnesses? I leaned back in my chair, hands folded calmly in my lap. The boardroom felt different now. The predators had become prey, and they could feel it. Before I tell you what that envelope contains, I said, my voice carrying the calm authority of a man who'd planned every move 3 steps ahead, and how I dismantled your 19-year conspiracy, you need to understand how we arrived at this moment. Preston's confident facade cracked completely now, fear replacing calculation in his eyes. Celeste looked between the envelope and me, her perfect composure shattering into something close to panic. Farah sat perfectly still, the way prey freezes when the predator's attention turns their direction. The DNA envelope sat on the mahogany table, federal agents standing witness. Preston's hands trembling slightly as they hovered near, but didn't touch the sealed truth. I'd promised to explain how we arrived at this moment of reckoning. To understand the trap that was about to close, you had to go back exactly 3 days to the morning my daughter walked into the kitchen without shedding a single tear, and I realized that grief reveals character faster than any interrogation technique I'd learned in 4 decades of military service. That envelope sitting on the boardroom table held the answer to everything. But to understand how I got there, how I went from grieving widower to military strategist, you need to go back 3 days. 3 days after burying Vera, I stood at the kitchen sink, washing a single coffee cup. The silence pressed against me like physical weight. 45 years of marriage, and now the house echoed with absence. I touched the granite counter she'd chosen when we renovated 15 years ago, cool beneath my palm. Vera had run her hands across this same stone in the showroom, declaring it perfect. She'd commanded this kitchen with the same precision she'd brought to everything, raising Celeste building Grover Defense alongside me, fighting cancer with grace that made doctors weep. Now the kitchen was just empty space. The bay window caught morning light the way she'd loved. I'd find myself staring at her empty chair at the breakfast table, expecting her to walk in with that slight smile, and ask why I was wasting a perfectly good Saturday standing around like furniture. Saturdays were for living, she used to say. Not waiting. But I wasn't waiting. I was surviving. There's a difference. The sound of expensive heels on hardwood shattered the silence. Celeste strode into the kitchen 3 days after her mother's funeral. No tears, perfect makeup, black designer suit that looked more like a business meeting than mourning. She slammed a thick manila folder onto the granite counter Vera had chosen. Emergency handover and succession agreement, printed across the top in bold letters. What is this, Celeste? I asked. She didn't sit, didn't hug me, didn't ask how I was sleeping or if I'd eaten. Just stood there with her arms crossed, radiating impatience. It's for your own good, Dad. You're 70 years old. You just lost Mom. You're in no condition to run a $40 million defense corporation. The words landed like accusations, as if grief was a disability, as if loving someone for 45 years and losing them somehow erased 4 decades of running a company that built precision components for the United States military. The company is running fine, I said quietly. I'm grieving. I'm not incapacitated. Not yet. She tapped the folder with manicured nails. But you will be. The stress alone could kill you. We need to be proactive. We, as if she'd built anything, as if she'd done more than attend quarterly dinners and smile for company photos while Vera and I worked 80-hour weeks turning government contracts into reality. They thought grief had made me weak. They forgot that military training doesn't disappear. With age, it crystallizes. The kitchen door swung open again. Preston entered with the calculated timing of a rehearsed performance. He placed his hand on my shoulder with manufactured warmth. "The doctor said your blood pressure has been dangerously high since Vera got sick. Dad." Preston said, his voice trembling with concern that felt practiced. "We don't want to lose you too." I looked at his hand on my shoulder. Preston had always been good at physical gestures that meant nothing. Hugs at Christmas, pats on the back at company events. The kind of touching that substitutes for actual connection. "Just sign the papers," he continued. "Let Ronan hold the title in the family trust. Celeste and I will handle daily operations. You can finally rest." Rest. The word kept appearing like it was the answer to a question I hadn't asked. I opened the folder, skimmed the legal language, saw the hidden clause buried on page 17, Preston as guardian and decision-maker until Ronan turned 30. 11 years of absolute control, transfer of assets, signing authority board appointments, transferring $40 million in defense contracts to a 19-year-old college freshman who couldn't be bothered to attend his grandmother's funeral. "And I need time to read it carefully," I said. Celeste's jaw tightened. Preston's hand squeezed my shoulder slightly harder. "Of course," Preston said smoothly. "Take your time. We just want what's best for everyone." They left the folder on the counter like a landmine and walked out. That evening I stood at the kitchen sink again. The bay window had gone dark, turning the glass into a mirror. I could see the reflection of the hallway behind me. Preston appeared in the reflection phone pressed to his ear. He glanced toward the kitchen, once saw my back to him, and started whispering. The tile amplified sound in strange ways. Vera used to joke that you couldn't keep secrets in this kitchen because the acoustics betrayed everything. Preston's whisper carried across the empty space. "The old man took the bait," he said into the phone. I went completely still. The water ran over the cup in my hands. "Get everything ready." Preston continued, his voice barely above a breath. "He'll sign by Friday." A pause. Then that smile, I could see it in the window's reflection, spreading across his face like he'd won something. "Once we have the company phase 2 starts, the CFO is already positioning the shell accounts." The cup slipped from my hands, hit the sink with a dull thud that didn't break the ceramic, but made Preston glance toward the kitchen again. I kept my back to him, hands in the running water, the picture of a grieving old man washing dishes while his world collapsed. He disappeared from the reflection. Front door opened and closed. I turned off the faucet slowly, dried my hands with the deliberate precision my drill instructors at West Point would have recognized. 40 years of combat operations, intelligence briefings, strategic planning, counterinsurgency, asset protection, enemy identification. This wasn't family grief anymore. This was battlefield assessment. In 3 seconds, 40 years of military discipline erased 3 weeks of mourning. The general had returned. Preston thought he'd whispered his conspiracy into a phone while a broken old man washed dishes. He had no idea that bay window glass had turned his secret into intelligence, that his target had just cataloged every word the old man, the bait Friday deadline, phase 2, shell accounts, the CFO. Celeste without tears 3 days after her mother's funeral. Preston with rehearsed concern about blood pressure he'd never cared about before. Legal documents prepared weeks in advance had to be given the complexity. 19-year-old Ronan as the front for an 11-year power grab. The CFO already positioning shell accounts. How long had they been planning this? How deep did the infiltration run? I stood motionless in the dark kitchen, hands perfectly dry, heartbeat slowing to combat-ready rhythm. Preston thought he'd trapped a grieving old man. He had no idea he'd just activated a predator who'd spent 4 decades dismantling more dangerous enemies than a son-in-law with forged documents. The war had begun, and they didn't even know they were already losing. 24 hours after that kitchen revelation, the war moved from reconnaissance to intelligence gathering. At 6 in the morning, I pulled into the empty executive parking lot of Grover Defense Logistics. The building stood dark against the October dawn. No other cars, no security guards visible through the glass entrance. Just the low hum of climate control systems and emergency lighting casting shadows across polished granite floors. I bypassed my corner office entirely. If Preston was planning a takeover, he'd need to alter foundational documents, operating agreements, trust structures, board authorizations. Everything that proved who actually owned what. Those records lived in one place, the executive archives at the end of the corridor behind reinforced security. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway. The building felt different this early. Stripped of people and activity, it was just steel and concrete, and 40 years of my work compressed into file systems and manufacturing floors. I reached the heavy security door, pulled my master key card from my wallet, the card I'd carried since founding the company, unlimited building access designed never to expire. I'd personally overseen the security protocols that made this card inviolable. I swiped it against the electronic reader. Harsh flat beep, angry red LED. Access denied. I stared at the reader, swiped again slower this time, making sure the magnetic strip connected properly. Red light, same error tone. Third swipe pressing the plastic hard against the sensor. Access denied. The infiltration wasn't theoretical anymore. It wasn't Preston whispering into phones or Celeste showing up with legal documents. This was concrete proof they had locked me out of my own company's most sensitive records. How long had they been planning this? Weeks, months. The security override required IT authorization, executive approval, physical access to servers. This wasn't something Preston could accomplish overnight. Having trouble with the door, the voice came from the shadows near the break room. I turned slowly. Farrah Kemp stepped into the dim corridor light at exactly 6 in the morning. Too perfect timing. She wore a custom suit that probably cost more than most employees made in a week. Her cologne, something expensive and overpowering, rolled off her in waves that made the air feel thick. She was far too awake and comfortable for a dawn arrival. The smile on her face didn't reach her eyes. "My master keycard seems to be malfunctioning," I said evenly. "It's rejecting my clearance for the executive archives." "Oh, right. I should have warned you." The CFO appearing at exactly 6 in the morning in an empty building wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation she'd been waiting for me. Farrah had worked at Grover Defense for 12 years, hired as a junior accountant promoted to financial controller, after 3 years elevated to chief financial officer 18 months ago, after our previous CFO retired. Vera had liked her, called her sharp, detail-oriented, trustworthy. Vera's judgment had been wrong about exactly one person in 45 years of marriage. "We're running a massive system update on the security servers this weekend," Farrah explained with rehearsed smoothness. Preston ordered a complete overhaul of the digital access protocols to protect corporate data. The system is temporarily restricting all sensitive areas while technicians migrate files. Preston ordered. Not the IT department, not the security team, not me, the actual owner of the company. Preston mentioned you'd be taking extended leave to mourn Vera. Farrah continued sympathy dripping from her voice like poison from a blade. So he took initiative to approve the technology overhaul. "Don't worry, we have everything completely under control." Extended leave, as if grief was a vacation, as if mourning my wife meant abandoning the company we'd built together. "I see," I said quietly. "I suppose a security update is long overdue. Tell Preston I appreciate his sudden interest in our data protection." The sarcasm was subtle enough that Farrah's smile widened. She thought I was broken, thought the grieving widower was accepting his forced retirement with polite resignation. "I'll let him know you stopped by," she said. "He'll be glad to hear you're not pushing yourself too hard during this difficult time." I turned away from the archives, walking toward my private office with the measured pace of a defeated old man. Farrah watched me leave. I could feel her eyes on my back, could sense the barely concealed mockery in her stance. She thought they'd won. They'd locked my keycard, locked me out of the archives, locked down the modern security systems that controlled access to everything they thought mattered. They fundamentally misunderstood how an old general protects his territory. The industrial espionage incident of 2013 had taught me a valuable lesson. A competitor had bribed our IT manager, gained access to proprietary manufacturing specifications, nearly destroyed a $20 million defense contract. We'd caught them eventually, but not before realizing our entire digital infrastructure was vulnerable. So I'd installed insurance, a completely independent system. Separate servers, encrypted connection, biometric access that only I could authorize, an external hard drive hidden in my private office that mirrored every transaction, every document, every email that passed through Grover Defense Logistics. Preston and Farrah didn't know it existed because it predated both of them. The IT team who'd installed it had retired or moved on. The documentation lived in my head, not in any corporate manual. They'd built their walls on the surface level, not knowing I'd been swimming beneath the foundation for 12 years. I walked into my private office and locked the heavy oak door behind me. The familiar space smelled of leather and old coffee. Vera's photograph still sat on the corner of my desk, her smile captured during our anniversary trip to Scotland 3 years ago. "They think they've locked me out," I said quietly to her picture. "They think controlling the surface means controlling the truth." I sat at my desk, opened the bottom drawer. Behind the hanging files and office supplies, beneath a wooden panel that looked like the drawer bottom, waited a biometric scanner no bigger than my thumb. I pressed my palm against it. A quiet click, the false bottom slid aside. There, covered in a thin layer of dust, sat the external hard drive that Preston and Farah didn't even know existed. 12 years of every transaction, every email, every document that had passed through company servers. Every shell company, every forged signature, every illegal transfer. If they'd been planning this for months or years, the evidence would be there. Buried in digital archives they thought they'd locked away from me forever. I pulled the hard drive from its hiding place and connected it to my laptop. The screen flickered to life. 22 months since I'd checked the backup. 22 months of data waiting to tell me exactly how deep Preston's conspiracy ran. The welcome screen glowed on my laptop, but I needed to understand what I was working with. I lifted the hard drive from the secret compartment, dust coating my fingers. The weight felt familiar, despite 12 years of dormancy. 2013, the year everything almost fell apart. A rival defense contractor, Titan Aerospace, had attempted digital infiltration to steal our logistics positioning system patents. $20 million worth of proprietary technology that would have destroyed us if they'd succeeded. We'd caught them eventually, but not before realizing our entire digital infrastructure was vulnerable. Preston had been in the family for 6 years by then, already working his way into positions of trust I should never have granted. After the Titan incident, I'd hired a programmer, former NSA, worked on classified networks, the kind of person who understood digital warfare better than most generals understood conventional combat. He'd built me an invisible backdoor into our network architecture. A digital ghost that could access everything without triggering modern security protocols. Vera never knew about it. I'd told her we'd upgraded our firewalls and moved on. The truth was more complicated. I'd installed insurance against a threat I couldn't fully articulate. Corporate espionage, yes, but also the nagging sense that trust could be weaponized, that access could be exploited. 12 years ago, I'd built this weapon to protect against competitors. I never imagined the real enemy would share my blood. I connected the hard drive to my personal laptop, not the company network. That was critical. This system operated completely independently and visible to anyone monitoring corporate servers. The screen flashed black. Cascading green code flooded the display like something from a spy thriller. I typed the complex password sequence, 42 characters, combining Vera's birth date and military format coordinates from our wedding location, and a phrase only I would remember. Military-grade encryption unlocked with a soft chime. The 12-year-old backdoor woke like a sleeping dragon. Directory after directory appeared on screen. Financial records, email, archives, document repositories. Everything that had passed through Grover Defense logistics servers since 2013 mirrored and encrypted, completely bypassing Farah's lockouts and Preston's fake security updates. Not a single alarm triggered. The modern systems they controlled had no idea I was there swimming beneath the foundation they thought they'd secured. I opened the financial directory first. 18 months of transactions loaded onto the screen. My finger hovered over the folder marked Executive Transfers when my private cell phone rang. The number I'd given only to family and my attorney. The screen displayed Northwestern Memorial Hospital. My combat-ready focus shattered instantly. Hospitals don't call at dawn with good news. Combat zones taught me that medical emergencies arrive with a specific kind of urgency, professional voices delivering information that changes everything. I answered on the second ring. Mr. Grover. A woman's voice, professional, but carrying that particular tension nurses develop when delivering bad news to families. This is Northwestern Memorial Hospital Emergency Department. We need you here immediately. What happened? My voice stayed steady. 40 years of military training, keeping the panic contained. Your grandson Ronan Vaughn was in a severe motorcycle accident. Highway collision about an hour ago. He's in trauma surgery now. How soon can you get here? The The office walls seemed to close in. Ronan, 19 years old. The boy I'd taught to ride a bike who'd spent summers at our Lake Forest estate, who'd inherited Vera's laugh and my stubborn refusal to quit anything. "I'm leaving now," I said. 20 minutes. She disconnected. I stared at the laptop screen, financial records glowing with evidence, the back door finally active after 12 years of waiting, everything I needed to dismantle Preston's conspiracy literally at my fingertips. And my grandson was bleeding in an operating room. The investigation could wait. Ronan couldn't. I slammed the laptop shut without logging out. The back door stayed active, running in the background, invisible and patient. I shoved the hard drive back into the secret compartment, but didn't bother locking it. My hands shook as I grabbed my car keys, the same hands that had stayed steady through combat briefings and crisis negotiations, now betraying the terror I couldn't voice. Severe motorcycle accident, trauma surgery. Those words carried specific meanings. I understood too well from military experience. Motorcycles traveling at highway speeds, the human body's fragility, the narrow window between arriving at the hospital and arriving too late. I ran through the empty executive corridor, past Farah's locked archives, past the conference rooms where we'd held strategy meetings and celebrated contract wins, past 40 years of my life compressed into corporate infrastructure that suddenly meant nothing compared to one 19-year-old boy who might be dying. The parking lot stretched empty in the dawn light. I reached my car hands fumbling with the key fob. The engine started with a roar that echoed off the surrounding buildings. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, 20 minutes if traffic cooperated, 15 if I ignored speed limits the way I intended to. I pulled out of the parking lot tires, squealing on the asphalt. The corporate headquarters disappeared in my rearview mirror. Behind me in my locked office sat a laptop with an active backdoor to 12 years of corporate secrets. The hard drive containing dormant power waited in an unlocked drawer. Everything I needed to dismantle Preston's conspiracy was finally activated, and I was racing away from it at 80 miles per hour. The morning traffic on Lakeshore Drive blurred past. Red lights became suggestions. Speed limits transformed into obstacles to navigate around. Every second mattered, when the difference between arriving in time and arriving too late could be measured in heartbeats. My phone sat on the passenger seat silent and accusing. No calls from Celeste, no frantic messages from Preston. Either they didn't know yet, or they were already at the hospital. The words repeated in my head like a combat briefing I couldn't escape. Tactical information that mattered more than any corporate conspiracy. My grandson Vera's grandson fighting for his life while I'd been playing digital detective games in an empty office. The hospital's distinctive modern towers appeared on the horizon. 10 minutes. I pressed the accelerator harder. What I didn't know yet was that Northwestern Memorial Hospital would crack open Preston's conspiracy in a way no computer ever could, that the emergency room would reveal a truth more devastating than any financial fraud. But first I had to get there while Ronan was still alive to save. I burst through the trauma ward corridor doors. At Northwestern Memorial Hospital, fluorescent lights, an antiseptic smell hitting me as I scanned desperately for Celeste Preston, anyone who could tell me if my grandson was still alive. Celeste paced near surgical bay, her designer heels clicking against linoleum in a rhythm that suggested hours of waiting. Preston slumped in a waiting room chair, expensive suit, rumpled tie, loosened. Both looked up as I approached. Celeste's face was pale but not tearful. Preston looked nervous, sweating, despite the hospital's aggressive air conditioning. "How bad is it?" I asked. "They stopped the bleeding," Celeste said. "He's stable, but there's a complication with the blood supply." Preston interrupted, his voice tight. The double doors to the surgical bay swung open. Dr. Harper emerged in blood-spotted scrubs, exhaustion lining a face that had clearly been fighting to save Ronan's life for the past 2 hours. The attending trauma physician was younger than I'd expected, maybe 40, with steady hands that still carried traces of surgical soap. "You're the grandfather?" Dr. Harper asked, looking at me. "Yes, Leland Grover. Your grandson is stable for now. We stopped the internal bleeding from the impact, repaired the damaged spleen, set the fractured ribs. But he's hemorrhaging at the cellular level. Hemoglobin levels are dropping critically. He needs an immediate massive blood transfusion to prevent hypovolemic shock." The medical terminology was precise, professional, and terrifying. "The hospital blood bank is depleted from a multi-car pileup this morning," Dr. Harper continued. We're arranging emergency transport from other facilities, but that takes time your grandson doesn't have. We need direct family donors immediately." "What's his blood type?" I asked. "A B positive." The world tilted slightly. I'd been blood type O my entire military career, required information for combat deployments, medical records, dog tags. Vera had been O as well. I remembered her mentioning it during pregnancy, something about universal donor status making her feel useful. Two O parents could only produce O offspring, basic Mendelian genetics, high school biology that every military officer learned for field medical situations. Celeste had to be type O genetic certainty. AB required both A and B alleles, impossible from two O parents, mathematically, biologically, scientifically impossible. The numbers didn't lie. The biology was absolute. Someone in this hospital corridor was hiding a truth that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. "We can bring you to the lab right now for cross-matching," Dr. Harper said. "Every minute counts." "Can't you just fly blood in helicopter?" Celeste's voice rose with panic that seemed disproportionate to the doctor's calm explanation. "We'll pay anything." Preston stood frozen, looking anywhere, except at me. Sweat beaded on his forehead, despite the cold corridor. "We're already arranging emergency transport," Dr. Harper said patiently. "But direct family donation would be faster and safer. Mr. Grover, if you'd come with me." "Just get the blood flown in," Celeste interrupted, her voice sharp. "I don't care what it costs." Preston nodded too quickly. "She's right. Let the professionals handle the blood supply." Neither of them offered to donate. Neither suggested getting tested. They wanted helicopter transport credit cards distanced from anything involving their blood, mixing with medical testing. Dr. Harper frowned slightly at their reaction, but accepted the platinum credit card Celeste shoved at her. "I'll coordinate with the blood transport service. Mr. Grover, you're welcome to wait in the family lounge. We'll update you as soon as the transfusion is complete." "I'll wait here until he's stable," I said. The doctor disappeared back through the surgical bay doors. Celeste resumed her pacing. Preston sat down heavily, pulling out his phone with shaking hands. "AB positive, 2O parents, genetic impossibility." I stood in that hospital corridor, understanding that Preston's conspiracy ran deeper than corporate takeover. This wasn't just about stealing money or manipulating succession documents. This was about biology, about blood, about a 19-year-old boy who couldn't possibly be my biological grandson. The afternoon passed in surgical updates and tense silence. By evening, Ronan was stable, transfusion complete, moved to intensive care recovery. Celeste and Preston left for home, exhaustion making them careless. I waited 2 hours, then drove to their Lake Forest estate with homemade soup as pretense the grieving grandfather checking on family after trauma. The biohazard collection bags had been in my jacket pocket since the morning hospital revelation. Military supply store, medical grade, sealed and sterile. I'd stopped at a pharmacy on the way, purchased latex gloves and evidence tweezers. Celeste accepted the soup with distracted gratitude. Preston barely looked up from his laptop. They were too drained from the hospital to notice when I asked to use the bathroom. Ronan's bathroom first. Electric toothbrush on the sink, bristles still damp from this morning before the accident. I sealed it in the first bag with gloved hands. Precision extraction, no contamination. "Hallway clear," Preston's voice drifting from the home office conference call about Monday's board meeting. "Laundry room next." Preston's workout shirt in the hamper. He always exercised Saturday mornings, creature of habit. 2 dark hairs visible on the collar root, follicles intact. Perfect DNA source. I moved through their home like a ghost, invisible, methodical gathering, the evidence they never imagined I'd think to collect. Tweezers extracted the hairs with surgical care. Second biohazard bag sealed, both samples secure in my jacket's inner pocket. "Thanks for checking on us," Celeste said when I emerged from the hallway 15 minutes later. "It means a lot." "Family takes care of family," I replied. The irony burned. I drove out of their gated neighborhood as darkness settled over Lake Forest. Right hand steady on the wheel, left hand resting on my jacket pocket, where 2 sealed biohazard bags contained scientific truth. In 48 hours, a private genetics laboratory would confirm what my military-trained mind already knew, with absolute certainty. The boy I'd loved as my grandson for 19 years didn't share a single drop of my blood, and someone was going to answer for that lie. But first I needed to see exactly how deep the financial rot had spread through the company I'd built. The backdoor server was still active, waiting in my locked office. The DNA would take 2 days to process. The financial evidence was ready now. The DNA samples couldn't wait until Monday. The financial investigation couldn't wait either. But the genetics lab had specific hours even for premium after-hours service. At 2 in the morning, I sat in my truck in an empty Evanston parking lot engine, idling, staring at the unmarked medical building where other people's secrets were tested in the dark. I'd driven north from Lake Forest through empty suburban streets, 2 biohazard bags on the passenger seat like radioactive cargo. 17 hours since the hospital revelation. No sleep since Ronan's accident. Combat-hardened patience sustained me through the exhaustion I'd operated on. Less sleep in hostile territory made life or death decisions, with 48 hours of wakefulness behind me. But this felt different. This was family. The GPS had guided me to an industrial medical district near Northwestern University campus. Most buildings stood dark except for scattered security lights. The address I'd been given showed no company name, no sign indicating purpose. Just a 3-story structure with a single light glowing on the 3rd floor. I'd called from the hospital parking lot that afternoon, while Celeste paced and Preston sweated and doctors stabilized Ronan. Found the lab through a private investigator's referral, the kind of place that asked no questions and remembered no faces. Premium after-hours service, $5,000 cash, 48-hour rush results, complete anonymity. The security buzzer beside the entrance featured a camera mounted above the door. I pressed the button. Name. A voice crackled through the intercom. Professional, detached, 3 syllables that conveyed absolutely nothing. Grover, 2 a.m. appointment. 3rd floor, elevator on your right. The door clicked open. The lobby was sterile white tile and fluorescent lighting. No receptionist, no waiting area furniture, no magazines or corporate art. Just walls and cameras and the elevator that carried me upward in mechanical silence. The 3rd floor hallway smelled of disinfectant and something chemical I couldn't identify. A single door stood open at the end of the corridor, spilling harsh white light across linoleum. The lab technician waited in a room that looked more like an operating theater than an office. Young, maybe 30, with the professional efficiency of someone who'd processed hundreds of family secrets and never remembered a single face. He introduced himself only as Ellis. 2 samples for paternity analysis. Ellis said not asking, just confirming what we both knew. Anonymous codes only, results in 48 hours. I handed over the sealed biohazard bags. Ellis labeled them with numerical sequences that meant nothing to anyone except the computer system. Subject A, Subject B, no names, no relationships, just genetic material waiting to reveal truth. The cash sat in my jacket pocket. $5,100 bills I'd withdrawn from a private account Vera and I had maintained for emergencies. This qualified. Ellis counted the money with mechanical precision. The analysis tests 21 genetic markers, he explained in the same clinical tone. Probability of paternity will be expressed as percentage 99.9% or higher, confirms biological relationship 0%, excludes it completely. I need certainty, I said, not probability. The science is absolute, Ellis replied. The phrasing is legal requirement, but yes, you'll have certainty. I was paying $5,000 in unmarked bills to prove my grandson wasn't my grandson. The absurdity would be funny if it weren't destroying me. Ellis placed the samples in a refrigerated storage unit, printed a receipt with the anonymous codes, and handed it to me like a parking stub. 48 hours. Results delivered via encrypted email to the address you provided. No phone calls, no paper trail. Understood. The transaction was complete. I'd bought scientific proof of betrayal for the cost of a used car. I walked back to the elevator in silence. The building lobby was exactly as empty as when I'd entered. Security camera watching. Door clicking locked behind me as I stepped into October's cold air. The temperature had dropped while I was inside, sharp cold against my face after the sterile lab warmth. My truck sat alone under a streetlight sanctuary and cage simultaneously. I sat in the driver's seat engine, running heat blowing across my hands. The receipt with anonymous codes felt heavy in my pocket, despite weighing nothing. 48 hours. The memory came unbidden. 35 years ago. Night before my first combat deployment. Sitting in the barracks at Fort Benning, unable to sleep, knowing morning would bring answers I couldn't predict. That same uncertainty. that same weight of waiting for truth that would change everything. But then the enemy wore a different uniform, operated from a different country. The threat was external, identifiable, something my training had prepared me to face. The last time I'd felt this particular kind of dread, I'd been wearing combat fatigues and carrying a rifle. Now, I wore a business suit and carried DNA samples. This enemy shared my name, ate at my table for 19 years, called me grandfather. The betrayal wasn't coming from across enemy lines. It was coming from inside my own family. I'd fought wars on 3 continents, survived ambushes, coordinated strikes against fortified positions, made strategic decisions that cost lives and saved more. The Army had given me medals for valor under fire commendations, for tactical brilliance promotions, for leadership in crisis. None of it prepared me for this. The waiting was the worst part. In combat, action replaced uncertainty. Orders came down, missions launched, objectives were achieved or failed. You moved forward because staying still meant death. But this 48 hours of knowing and not knowing simultaneously, this was a different kind of warfare. The kind where you had to keep breathing, keep functioning, keep pretending everything was normal while your entire world crumbled beneath your feet. I pulled out of the parking lot, leaving the unmarked building behind. The streets were empty. Most of Chicago slept, while I drove through darkness, carrying truth that would destroy my family. 48 hours. In 48 hours, science would confirm what genetics already screamed and what my military-trained mind had calculated in that hospital corridor. But 48 hours was a lifetime when you were alone at 2 a.m., knowing that when the sun rose, you'd have to smile at Celeste's phone call about Ronan's recovery, accept Preston's manufactured concern about my health, attend whatever corporate meeting they'd scheduled as part of their takeover plan, all while carrying the receipt in my pocket that proved my grandson wasn't my grandson. The highway stretched ahead, empty and dark. I had a company to investigate before dawn. The backdoor server was waiting. The financial evidence wouldn't require 48 hours to process. It was ready now, sitting in my home office exactly where I'd left it. If DNA would prove the biological betrayal, the server would prove the financial one. I pressed the accelerator and drove south toward home. I couldn't wait 48 hours doing nothing. The DNA samples were submitted, the countdown begun, but sleep was impossible. I drove straight home, from Evanston, walked into my office at 2:45 a.m., and stared at the laptop I'd abandoned that morning when the hospital called. The screen was dark, but the backdoor connection was still active exactly as I'd left it, waiting, patient. I poured black coffee from the pot I'd made before midnight, before the genetics lab, before everything, and opened the laptop. My phone vibrated violently on the desk at 3 in the morning. The automated security alert I'd coded into the backdoor server 12 years ago. The one I'd hoped never to see. Someone was attempting a massive unauthorized wire transfer using my digital credentials. I opened the alert. The transaction details filled the screen in clinical precision. Source account, employee retirement fund. Destination offshore routing number through Cayman Islands. Amount $4.5 million. The digital signature was perfect. A flawless forgery of my authorization pattern, complete with the security protocols I'd implemented 5 years ago. Whoever created this had been studying my transaction history for months, maybe years. But they didn't know about the backdoor. My military-trained mind processed the details instantly. They weren't stealing from operating revenue, not from expansion reserves or emergency contingency funds. They were draining employee retirement accounts. 200 truck drivers, warehouse managers, logistics coordinators, assembly workers, people who'd built this company alongside Vera and me, people we'd promised would be protected after years of service, families counting on pensions we'd funded for decades. Preston and Farah were stealing their futures. They weren't just stealing from me. They were stealing the retirement security of every driver, every manager, every loyal worker who trusted me to protect what they had earned. The rage came cold and precise, not the hot anger of betrayal that had burned out somewhere between the hospital and the genetics lab. This was something else, military fury, the kind that made tactical decisions and executed them without hesitation. Suspended in digital purgatory where Preston couldn't complete the transaction, couldn't cancel. It couldn't erase the footprint of his attempt. The money hung there like evidence in amber, perfect, preserved, undeniable. Every detail logged. Timestamp, routing numbers, source account, destination coordinates, the forged digital signature, Everything the FBI would need to build a federal case for wire fraud, embezzlement, and identity theft. I screenshot the transaction attempt, downloaded the complete server log, saved 3 redundant copies to encrypted drives that Preston and Farah couldn't touch even if they discovered the backdoor's existence. Then I picked up my phone and dialed Dashiell's private number, the one he'd given me 25 years ago, with explicit instructions to call any time, day or night, if the company faced crisis. 3:08 a.m. He answered on the second ring, voice completely alert, no sleep in his tone, no confusion about why I'd be calling before dawn. "I'm listening," Dashiell said. "They just attempted to transfer $4.5 million from employee pension funds using my forged digital signature." I said, delivering the information in 90 seconds of precise military briefing. "I've frozen the transaction. Everything's logged: routing numbers, timestamps, forged authorization protocols. The money's suspended mid-transfer. Perfect evidence." "Are they aware you've blocked it?" Smirked. "No. The system shows pending authorization on their end. They think it's processing normally." "Good." Dashiell's voice carried the satisfaction of a chess player watching his opponent walk into checkmate. "I'll call Miller right now." Miller, FBI Special Agent, Economic Crimes Division. Dashiell had mentioned the name once months ago during a conversation about corporate fraud protections. 3 a.m, Dashiell answered like he'd been sitting by the phone waiting. "Don't touch anything else," Dashiell continued. "The FBI will want that server exactly as is. Every log, every timestamp. The evidence needs to remain pristine." "How long have you known?" I asked. A pause, brief, calculated. "I've suspected Preston was positioning for takeover since Vera got sick," Dashiell said carefully. "The succession documents Celeste brought to your house weren't drafted overnight. That level of legal complexity requires months of preparation. I started building countermeasures the day you called about the kitchen conversation." "You've been coordinating with the FBI?" "With Agent Miller, yes, quietly. We needed evidence that would survive federal prosecution standards. You just gave us that evidence." The attorney I'd trusted for 25 years had been running his own investigation parallel to mine, building a legal case while I'd been gathering proof. "The DNA results come back in 48 hours, I said. Of course Dashiell had arranged the lab. Of course he'd been 3 steps ahead, coordinating pieces I hadn't even seen moving. "Miller will want to move fast," Dashiell said. "Attempted theft of this magnitude with your pension fund compromised gives him jurisdiction and urgency. I'll brief him on the full scope, the succession fraud, the forged documents, the corporate infiltration. By Monday morning, we'll have federal warrants. Monday's too late if they try another transfer." "They won't. The system shows pending. They'll wait for confirmation before attempting anything else. We have a 72-hour window." 72 hours, the same time frame as the DNA results. "Hey, stay available," Dashiell said. "Miller will want to interview you directly, probably later today. For now, get some sleep. You've been awake for 24 hours. 22. Close enough, sleep. Let the FBI do what they do best." He disconnected. I sat in my home office staring at the laptop screen where $4.5 million hung suspended in digital limbo. Perfect evidence of attempted grand larceny. Dashiell was calling Miller right now, 3:10 in the morning, and somewhere in Chicago, an economic crimes agent was about to start building a federal case. The net was closing around Preston and Farah, and they had no idea they were already caught. But I needed to understand the full scope of their conspiracy before the FBI moved. The pension fund theft was just one transaction. There had to be more. Shell companies, offshore accounts, a financial architecture sophisticated enough to fool auditors. The backdoor server contained 12 years of corporate transactions. I had 4 hours until dawn. I started digging. With the FBI alerted and the transaction frozen, I turned my focus to the question that mattered most. Where was the $4.5 million supposed to go? The backdoor server interface gave me access to routing data Preston thought was invisible. I traced the destination numbers through the digital architecture, following the money like tracking enemy movements through hostile territory. The transaction was designed to bounce through 3 international banks, Zurich, Singapore, Grand Cayman, before reaching its final destination. Professional money laundering. The kind of sophisticated financial choreography that required expertise beyond Preston's capabilities. Farah, the CFO who'd worked here 12 years, who understood our systems, our protocols, our oversight gaps. I dug deeper into the historical transaction logs. The pension fund theft wasn't isolated, it was the crescendo of a symphony that had been playing for months. 4 shell companies registered in Delaware. Generic, meaningless names designed to sound legitimate while revealing nothing. Global Freight Solutions, Apex Logistics Consulting, Horizon Management Partners, Zenith Supply Chain Associates. Each company had submitted invoices for phantom services, software upgrades that never happened, consulting work that was never performed, logistics optimization for routes that didn't exist. The invoices were carefully calculated to slide beneath the automatic board review, threshold 30,000 here, 45,000 there. Amounts large enough to steal millions over time, but small enough to avoid triggering oversight. Systematic, organized, professional theft. I cross-referenced the withdrawal dates with my personal calendar, needed to understand the timeline. When had this started? The first major transfer appeared on my screen April 18th, 2024. My chest tightened. April 18th, the day his world ended, the day Vera's oncologist said terminal, and the same day they started stealing. That was the exact week Vera received her pancreatic cancer diagnosis. The week I sat in oncology waiting rooms holding her hand, while doctors explained survival statistics and treatment options that wouldn't work. The week our world collapsed into hospital visits and medical terminology and the slow understanding that 45 years together was ending. While I watched my wife dying, Preston and Farah were plundering the company we'd built. They'd weaponized my grief as distraction, timed their theft to the moment I was most vulnerable, used Vera's terminal illness as cover for systematic robbery. The coffee in my cup had gone cold hours ago. I drank it anyway, bitter, appropriate. I drilled deeper into Apex Logistics Consulting's records. One contract stood out, signed with Hammond Defense Systems, my former military procurement partner from 2008 to 2015. The company I'd worked with on logistics contracts worth $30 million over 7 years. The contract claimed Apex was providing supply chain optimization services to Hammond, invoices totaling $380,000, all approved, all paid. I pulled up Hammond's CEO contact from my personal directory and called his private number. 7 in the morning on a Saturday early, but Dick Hammond was former Army like me. He'd be awake. Leland Hammond answered on the 3rd ring. Been too long? How are you holding up after Vera? I need to ask about a contract. I said, skipping pleasantries. Apex Logistics Consulting. Ring any bells? A pause. No, should it? According to my company's records, you've been paying them for supply chain services since June, $380,000. That's impossible. We handle logistics in-house. Always have. Who the hell is Apex? A shell company, using my name as reference. Hammond's voice hardened. Someone's running fraud using your credentials. Yes. Jesus, Leland, I'm sorry. We never authorized any such contract. If someone's invoicing under a fake company using your reputation, that's identity theft on top of fraud. I know, I'm documenting everything. The FBI will be in touch. I hung up and stared at the screen. They'd turned his honor into their weapon. His name, his service, his reputation. Preston hadn't just stolen money. He'd weaponized my 40-year military career, used my defense industry relationships, turned my name into a tool for fraud. Every fake contract bore the invisible signature of my credibility. Every phantom invoice traded on relationships I'd built through decades of honorable service. Preston had taken the reputation I'd spent a lifetime earning and transformed it into criminal currency. That was the genius of it in a sick way. No one questioned invoices from companies associated with Leland Grover, former brigadier general, decorated veteran, respected defense contractor. My name was the seal of legitimacy that made the fraud invisible. I leaned back from the laptop. Dawn light was breaking through the office windows. I'd been investigating for 4 hours straight, no sleep in 24 hours. But exhaustion was a luxury I couldn't afford. The complete picture was forming. Preston and Farah had created 4 shell companies, submitted hundreds of fake invoices over 6 months, used my military credentials and defense connections to give the fraud credibility, timed the systematic theft to coincide with Vera's terminal illness, and when they'd bled the company sufficiently through small cuts, they'd moved to the killing blow, draining the employee pension fund. $4.5 million, 200 families, people who'd trusted me to protect their futures. But the money was just theft, recoverable. The FBI would freeze accounts, claw back funds, restore the pensions. The use of my name that was different, that was desecration. For 40 years, I'd built a reputation based on integrity, military service, fair dealings, keeping my word. That reputation had value beyond money. It represented who I was, what I stood for, the legacy I'd intended to leave. Preston had stolen that and turned it into a criminal tool. That wasn't just theft. That was personal violation, an attack on everything I'd spent a lifetime building. I sat watching sunrise through the office window, 4 hours of investigation, yielding perfect clarity. Preston and Farah had stolen millions, created fake companies, forged invoices, but their greatest crime was weaponizing the name I'd spent 40 years building through honorable service. For the money, they'd get federal prison. For my name, my reputation, my honor, twisted into their fraud for that there would be no mercy. But financial records only told part of the story. I needed to understand the personal connection between Preston and Farah. How long had they been planning this? What bound them together beyond greed? The backdoor server revealed what they'd stolen, but it couldn't tell me who they really were beneath the masks they had worn for years. For that, I needed someone who could investigate what computers couldn't reach. Someone who could dig into backgrounds, relationships, hidden connections. I needed a private investigator, the kind who asked uncomfortable questions and found answers people tried to bury. I pulled up my contacts and started searching. At 9 that morning, exhausted from 24 hours without sleep, but driven by cold purpose, I pulled up to an unmarked building in Chicago's industrial South Side. Weathered brick, frosted glass door. The kind of place that didn't advertise what happened inside. Financial records showed me what Preston stole, but they couldn't tell me who Farah really was or what bound her to my son-in-law beyond greed. For that, I needed someone who specialized in finding answers people tried to bury. The address came from a military contact who'd used private investigators for security clearance verifications. A former FBI, specialized in corporate fraud, discreet. The kind of professional who understood that some investigations required staying invisible. I climbed 3 flights of stairs, my legs heavy with exhaustion. The hallway smelled of old coffee and industrial cleaning solution. A single door at the end bore no nameplate, just a number, 307. I knocked twice. "It's open," a voice called from inside. The office was exactly what I'd expected. Filing cabinets lined one wall, conspiracy boards covered another, photographs connected by red string, the visual language of investigation. A coffee maker gurgled in the corner, adding to the permanent caffeine smell embedded in the furniture. Conrad Sterling sat across a battered desk that had seen decades of case files and client confessions. 50 years old, with silver-threaded hair and the quiet intensity of a man who'd spent 20 years hunting white-collar criminals for the FBI. He wore a Navy suit with an FBI service pin on the lapel, small enough to be subtle, visible enough to establish credibility. His weathered hands rested on the desk. Hands that had opened thousands of evidence boxes sorted through financial crimes more complex than most people could imagine. The calluses weren't from manual labor. They were from decades of handling truth. He recognized desperation in another man's eyes. I could see it in how he studied me, the assessment of someone who had interviewed countless people at their worst moments. "General Grover," Sterling said, not asking, just confirming. "You said it was urgent, corporate fraud investigation." "I need someone who understands how professionals steal," I said, sitting in the chair across from him. "The FBI recommended your name." 20 years in economic crimes, Sterling replied. "Retired 3 years ago. Now I work for people who can't wait for federal bureaucracy. What are we looking at?" I pulled 3 folders from my briefcase and set them on his desk. "My son-in-law and CFO are systematically stealing from the company I built. $4.5 million from employee pensions. Multiple shell companies, forged invoices using my military credentials for credibility." Sterling opened the first folder with methodical precision. His FBI service pin caught the fluorescent light as he leaned forward, arranging the documents across his desk like reconstructing a crime scene. Each page placed deliberately. Each detail absorbed. Those calloused fingers turned pages with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd spent 2 decades doing exactly this, sorting truth from lies, finding patterns in financial chaos. He studied the frozen transaction log, the shell company and corporation documents, the fake invoices bearing my reputation as invisible endorsement. These aren't amateur mistakes, Sterling said quietly. Whoever built this architecture knew what they were doing. Multiple jurisdictions, calculated amounts beneath review thresholds, professional money laundering. My CFO, I said. 12 years with the company. She had access knowledge and apparently no conscience. Sterling opened the second folder, DNA results, showing Ronan wasn't Preston's biological son. His expression didn't change, but I saw the shift in his eyes. The recognition that this wasn't just corporate theft. Family conspiracy, he said. My daughter Celeste delivered succession documents 3 days after my wife's funeral. Preston has been positioning himself for takeover since Vera got sick. The theft began the exact week she received terminal diagnosis. They weaponized your grief. Yes. Sterling leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. 20 years of FBI experience processing what I'd laid before him. I've seen shell companies before, General, he said. But this is sophisticated. They're not just stealing money, they're destroying your credibility. Using your name, your military service, your defense industry relationships as criminal tools. Can you find out who Farah really is? What she has on Preston? Of course. I can find out, Sterling said. But based on what you've shown me, this isn't a family dispute. This is organized conspiracy. The kind that requires insider access, long-term planning, and coordination between multiple parties. He paused, studying the documents again. To take this down completely, we're going to need someone inside Grover Defense. Someone they trust. Someone who can report their movements, document their conversations, gather evidence we can't access from outside. An insider. Someone Preston and Farah wouldn't suspect. Someone with access to executive floors and board meetings and private conversations. I already knew exactly who that would be. Saskia Winslet, my executive secretary for 15 years. The only person in the building who still looked me in the eye after Preston's lockout. Loyal, positioned perfectly, and absolutely furious about what they were doing to the company Vera and I had built. But first, Sterling needed to understand the full scope. What do you need from me? I asked. Everything you have on Farah Kemp. Employment history references background checks from when she was hired. I'll start there and work backward. Most people who run sophisticated fraud have done it before, just smaller scale, different names. Or they didn't get caught. I pulled out my checkbook. How much? 10,000 retainer. Daily rate after that. I work fast, this shouldn't take more than a week. I wrote the check and slid it across the desk. Sterling picked it up, glanced at the amount, and set it aside without comment. Then he looked at me with the same intensity I'd seen in intelligence officers before critical operations. I'll find out who Farah really is, he said. What she has on your son-in-law, how long they've been planning this. But based on what you've shown me, we're going to need someone inside Grover Defense, someone they trust. The hunt had begun, and I already knew exactly who that insider would be. I stood, shook Sterling's weathered hand, Callus's meeting, Callus's veteran, recognizing veteran, and walked out of his office. By the time I reached the street, I was already planning the conversation with Saskia, the diner where we'd meet, the evidence I'd show her, the mission I'd ask her to accept. Preston and Farah thought they controlled the company. They'd locked my keycard, frozen my access, positioned themselves as victors. But they'd forgotten one critical detail. Loyalty doesn't live in computer systems. It lives in people. And the woman who'd watched me build Grover Defense for 15 years wasn't going to let them destroy it without a fight. I was driving back from Sterling's office when my personal phone vibrated with a text from a number I recognized immediately. Saskia Winslet, my executive secretary for 15 years. Need to talk, alone. Moon and Stars, Cafe Noon. When my executive secretary of 15 years sent that coded text, I knew the conspiracy had already begun fracturing from within. She'd never used that phrasing before, never requested meetings off-site. The message itself was a signal that something had pushed her past the point of corporate propriety into genuine alarm. I changed course, heading toward the cafe, 2 blocks from company headquarters. Saskia sat in a back booth when I arrived, hands wrapped around a coffee cup she hadn't touched. 58 years old, with the weathered competence of someone who'd spent decades managing the chaos behind executive decisions. She'd been my executive secretary since 2010, hired the same year. Vera and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary. The only person in the building who still looked me in the eye after Preston's lockout. She saw me enter and gestured to the booth. I slid in across from her, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set. "General," she said quietly, "something's wrong. Preston locked you out Monday and that CFO has been in his office every night since. They're not even hiding it anymore." "And how much do you know?" I asked. "Enough to know you didn't authorize the pension fund transfer," Saskia said, her voice dropping even lower. "I've seen the routing codes, the amount. I process executive authorizations that one came through Saturday night when nobody was supposed to be working, and it had your digital signature, but the authorization protocol was wrong. She'd contacted me first. Before I could reach out to recruit her, she'd already detected the irregularities and decided whose side she was on." "How long have you suspected?" I asked. "Since the lockout. Preston doesn't have the authority to revoke your building access, but he did it anyway, and Farah backed him up with some fabricated IT security story." Saskia's hands tightened around her coffee cup. "I've been watching them. Late-night meetings, closed-door sessions. The CFO practically lives in Preston's office now. I made a decision. Saskia had already chosen loyalty. Now she deserved truth. And the DNA test came back," I said. "Preston isn't mine, never was." Saskia's face went pale. "My God! Ronan isn't Preston's biological son either. The hospital blood test revealed it. AB positive from 2 O-type parents, genetically impossible. And the CFO knew," Saskia said, not asking, just processing. "She orchestrated everything," I confirmed. "The theft, the lockout, the systematic destruction of my reputation. They've been planning this for months, maybe years. Started stealing the week Vera got her terminal diagnosis. Saskia's weathered hands, 15 years filing defense contracts, typing classified memos, organizing medal ceremonies, trembled slightly as she set down her coffee cup. "What do you need?" she asked simply. No hesitation, no doubt, just immediate commitment. "I need you inside," I said. "Pretend you accept Preston's authority. Act like you're adapting to the new regime, but report everything to me. Every meeting, every decision, every conversation you overhear." "What do you need first?" "Friday's emergency board meeting," I said. "I need to know who's attending, what's on the agenda, which board members are committed to Preston, and which ones might still remember 40 years of service." Saskia nodded slowly. "The agenda's already posted on the internal system. Leadership transition vote. Asset reallocation approval." My chest tightened. "They're moving to make it permanent. Friday at 10 a.m. They're trying to formalize everything before you can mount a counteroffensive." Saskia pulled out her phone, scrolled through notes. 7 of 9 board members have confirmed attendance. Preston's been calling them personally, talking about your age, your grief, your inability to handle the stress. "Which 2 are wavering?" "Morrison and Caldwell. They've both worked with you for 20 years. Morrison keeps asking why you're not at the meetings. Caldwell requested to speak with you directly before Friday, but Preston blocked it." 2 votes. If I could reach Morrison and Caldwell before Friday, remind them who actually built this company, maybe I could prevent Preston from cementing his theft into corporate legitimacy. "I'll handle Morrison and Caldwell," I said. "You focus on documentation, record everything, take notes on who says what. If Preston or Farah discuss anything financial, I need to know exact words." "Secure communication protocol," Saskia asked, already thinking like an operative. "My personal phone. Coded texts only. Nothing through company systems. They're monitoring everything." "Understood." She stood to leave, and I saw what Preston and Farah had missed. Loyalty isn't bought with paychecks. It's earned through decades of mutual respect, and that currency couldn't be stolen. "I'll be in that boardroom Friday," Saskia said. "For you, not them." "Be careful," I warned. "If they suspect you're feeding me information—" "General, I've been watching you fight honorable battles for 15 years. Saskia interrupted. "Through government contract negotiations, through Vera's illness, through every crisis this company has faced. I'm not stopping now, just because the enemy happens to share your name." She walked out first, disappearing into the lunch crowd on the sidewalk, as if she'd just finished a routine administrative meeting, nothing suspicious, nothing that would trigger Preston or Farah's attention. But everything had changed. I sat in that booth for another 5 minutes, drinking coffee that had gone cold, processing the shift in tactical advantage. Preston and Farah thought they controlled the company. They'd locked my access position themselves as the new leadership scheduled a board meeting to formalize their coup. But they'd made one critical miscalculation. They'd assumed loyalty was a function of power, that whoever controlled the executive floor controlled the people. They'd forgotten that some bonds couldn't be severed by digital lockouts or manufactured authority. Saskia would be in that boardroom Friday, recording, documenting, reporting every word back to me. And in the 48 hours before that meeting, I'd be reaching out to Morrison and Caldwell, reminding them that 40 years of honorable service counted for more than 1 week of criminal conspiracy. Before we separated, I slid a folded paper across the table, the boardroom console authorization code, valid only for Friday morning. "Memorize it," I said. "Don't write it down." Saskia pocketed it without looking at it. She didn't need to. I left cash on the table and walked out into the October afternoon. The endgame was approaching. Friday's board meeting would be the battlefield where Preston's lies met my truth. And now I had an ally inside enemy territory who remembered what loyalty actually meant. The 48 hours until Friday's board meeting gave me one critical window I couldn't waste. But first, I had to know the complete truth about my family. The receptionist at Safe Genome Diagnostics handed me the sealed envelope at 8:45 a.m. Thursday morning, and I knew before opening it that the last thread connecting me to my grandson was about to snap. I'd submitted those DNA samples 2 days ago in the middle of the night, paying for expedited processing that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The lab had promised results within 48 hours. They'd delivered exactly on schedule. I walked to my car in the empty parking lot, locked the doors. The envelope sat on the passenger seat like a bomb waiting to detonate. The October morning was cold. My breath fogged the windows. I sat in that enclosed space preparing for private devastation, the way I'd once prepared for combat briefings by acknowledging that some truths changed everything and there was no going back. I opened the envelope with military precision, hands steady despite the chaos screaming inside my chest. Single sheet of paper, clinical language, anonymous subject codes instead of names. My eyes scanned the technical details, genetic markers, probability calculations, statistical methodology, all the scientific scaffolding that turned human relationships into numerical certainty. Then the final line. Probability of biological relationship between subject A and subject B, 0.00%. Preston wasn't Ronan's biological father. The 19-year-old boy I'd watched grow up, who'd spent summers at our Lake Forest estate, who'd inherited Vera's laugh, who'd called me Grandpa. His entire life shared no blood with the man claiming to be his father. 2 generations of paternity fraud. First, Preston wasn't my biological son. The hospital blood test had proven that with AB positive impossibility from 2 O-type parents. Now, Ronan wasn't Preston's biological son, science confirming what genetics had already screamed, which meant either Celeste Preston's wife had deceived him about Ronan's parentage, or she knew Preston wasn't the biological father and was complicit in a deeper conspiracy. Another layer of lies built on top of lies, built on top of theft. I set the paper on the passenger seat and pulled out my phone, set a timer for 60 seconds, the same drill I'd used in field hospitals when casualties came in faster than we could process them, allow brief grief then move forward because the mission required it. 60 seconds. I let myself feel. Ronan at age 3, sticky hands gripping my uniform collar after I'd returned from a deployment. "Grandpa, you're my hero." And I'd believed the genetics didn't matter, because love did. Ronan at 8 learning to ride a bike in our driveway, while Vera cheered and I ran alongside, holding the seat. Ronan at 15 asking about military service and whether honor still mattered in a world that seemed to value nothing except money. 19 years of memories, birthdays, holidays, quiet conversations. The boy I'd loved as my grandson despite sharing no blood. Now both links are broken. Ronan wasn't my grandson by blood, wasn't even Preston's son by blood. Just a 19-year-old college kid caught in a web of deception he probably didn't even know existed. The timer buzzed. 60 seconds expired. I folded the DNA results with the same precision I'd used to fold a flag at Vera's funeral, filed it in the briefcase with the other evidence. The frozen pension transfer, the shell company and corporation documents, the forged invoices using my military reputation. Now this. Scientific proof that my family was constructed from lies. I started the engine, checked the dashboard clock. 8:52 a.m. Sterling's office in 18 minutes. I'd scheduled a follow-up meeting to review whatever he'd uncovered about Farah's background. But now I had a new question for him. Celeste. Preston's wife, Ronan's mother. The one person in this conspiracy I hadn't investigated yet, because I'd assumed she was just another victim of Preston's deception. Except if Ronan wasn't Preston's biological son, then Celeste either didn't know making her a victim, or she did know making her a co-conspirator. How many lies deep did this conspiracy go? And was my daughter a victim or an architect? The math was simple but devastating. Preston married Celeste 19 years ago. Ronan was born 8 months later. If Preston wasn't the biological father, then Celeste had been pregnant before the wedding, carrying another man's child, and somehow convinced Preston the baby was his. Or Preston knew Ronan wasn't his biological son. Married Celeste anyway. Raised a child he knew wasn't his. All while planning to steal from the family who'd accepted him. The conspiracy had just doubled in scope. Preston wasn't mine. Ronan wasn't Preston's. Someone had orchestrated 2 generations of paternity fraud, and I needed to understand why. What was the end game? What made sense about stealing from a family while raising children who weren't biologically connected to anyone? Unless the point was never about family, it was always about money. Preston married into the Grover name to gain access to the company, raised Ronan as leverage the grandson who'd inherit everything with Preston as guardian controlling the assets. The succession documents Celeste had delivered made perfect sense now. Transfer everything to Ronan, Preston as guardian until age 30. 11 years of absolute control over a company worth $40 million. Except Ronan wasn't Preston's biological son, which meant if anyone ever discovered the truth, Preston's claim to guardianship collapsed, unless he'd already planned to disappear before anyone found out. The one-way ticket, the fake passport, the systematic theft disguised as legitimate business expenses. Preston had been planning to take the money and run, leaving Celeste and Ronan behind to face the consequences. I pulled out of the parking lot, DNA results secured in my briefcase mind, processing the tactical implications. The Friday board meeting was 30 hours away. Morrison and Caldwell needed to be contacted. The FBI was building their case. Sterling was investigating Farah. And now I had proof that the conspiracy ran deeper than I'd imagined. 2 generations of paternity fraud. A 19-year-old boy who had no idea his entire identity was built on lies. A daughter-in-law who was either a victim or a conspirator. I drove towards Sterling's office, watching the city pass by through windows that separated me from a world that seemed simpler than it actually was. The warrior had resumed. The 60 seconds of grief were locked away in the same compartment where I'd stored every other casualty I couldn't afford to process during active operations. But I made myself a promise. When this was over, when Preston was in federal custody, when the company was secure, when the board meeting was done, I'd allow myself more than 60 seconds to mourn the grandson I'd lost, despite loving him, for 19 years. Sterling had called midday with a location change, not his office. A Southside diner where conversations disappeared into the clatter of dishes and the hum of lunch crowds. More private than any office could ever be. Conrad Sterling slid the manila envelope across the booth at precisely 2 p.m., and the first photograph inside would prove Preston had planned to abandon his dying wife 3 months before her final breath. 5 hours, Sterling said without preamble. That's all it took to confirm your son-in-law isn't just a thief, he's a flight risk. I opened the envelope. The dossier was thick. Surveillance photos, financial documents, travel records. The kind of comprehensive investigation that came from 20 years of FBI training and knowing exactly where to look. What did you find? I asked. Everything, Sterling replied. And it's worse than you thought. The first photographs showed Preston and Farah at restaurants. Not romantic venues, business settings, coffee shops, hotel conference rooms. One image captured them at a back table laptop, open between them. Financial documents spread across the surface. They're not sleeping together, Sterling said, watching me study the photos. This isn't passion, it's profit. The financial partners, I said. Partners who've been planning this for months, maybe years. Sterling tapped one photograph, showing Preston and Farah shaking hands across a table. Every meeting I documented was transactional. They're not having an affair. They're running a business, and that business is stealing from you. It was almost worse than romance. An affair could be explained by weakness, by emotion, by human failing. But this calculated partnership based purely on greed revealed something colder. I turned to the next section of the dossier, a photocopy of a passport. Marcus Bellamy, Sterling said. That's who Preston becomes when he runs. The passport photo was unmistakably Preston, but the name was different. Marcus James Bellamy. Birth date altered by 3 years. Place of birth listed as Portland, Oregon, instead of the actual New Jersey. Professional forgery, the kind that cost serious money and required connections to people who specialized in creating new identities. How long has he had this? I asked. Issued 4 months ago, Sterling said. Before your wife got sick. 4 months. July. Before Vera's diagnosis. Before the systematic theft began. Before anything that could be explained as opportunistic crisis exploitation. Preston had been planning his exit before the crisis even started. There's more, Sterling said, pulling out a printed itinerary. One-way ticket. Passenger name, Marcus Bellamy. Destination, Grand Cayman. Departure flexible booking, no specific date locked in yet. But the purchase date was stamped clearly across the top. August 15th, 2024. My hands went cold. Vera was diagnosed April 18th, I said quietly. He booked this ticket a week before your wife found out she was dying. Sterling confirmed. I remembered Vera's hospital room in May, Preston sitting beside her bed during chemotherapy, holding her hand, pretending to comfort her, while poison dripped through IV lines that would ultimately fail to save her life. And the entire time, that plane ticket sat in his desk drawer, waiting. What kind of man books an escape a week before his wife receives a terminal diagnosis and still pretends to grieve when she dies? The answer was simple. The kind of man who'd married into a family for money, raised a child who wasn't his biological son, as leverage and systematically planned theft, while maintaining the facade of devoted family member. And this changes the timeline, I said, forcing my voice to stay level. I thought the theft was opportunistic, exploiting Vera's illness as distraction, but he was planning this before she even got sick. The theft was always the plan, Sterling agreed. Your wife's illness just provided convenient cover, made you vulnerable, gave Preston justification for taking over operations while you were distracted with hospitals and oncologists. I studied the fake passport again, Marcus Bellamy, a complete fiction, an escape identity waiting to be activated. This isn't a coup, Sterling said, leaning back in the booth. It's a cash and dash. Preston never intended to actually run your company long term. He just needed to steal enough to make the escape worthwhile. When does he run? I asked. My guess, right after Friday's board meeting, once the asset transfer is legal. Sterling pulled out another document. The succession papers Celeste delivered transfer company control to Ronan with Preston as guardian. If the board approves that Friday, Preston gets legal authorization to manage all assets. He'll wire money offshore through those shell companies, then vanish. Leaving everyone to face the consequences, Sterling corrected. The pension fund employees, your daughter, your grandson, everyone except Preston, who'll be drinking rum on a Caribbean beach under a fake name. The diner smelled of coffee and grease and the kind of ordinary life that seemed impossibly distant. Around us, people ate lunch and talked about normal problems. Nobody else was sitting in a booth learning that their family was constructed entirely from lies and theft. There's one more thing, Sterling said, pulling out a final document. I tracked Farah's background like you asked. She's not CFO material by training. Business degree from a mediocre college. No previous executive experience. Only got hired at Grover Defense because Preston recommended her. He planted her, I said. 12 years ago. Long game. He married your daughter, got himself positioned as family, then slowly inserted his accomplice into your financial operations. Sterling's weathered hands arranged the documents across the table, like evidence at a trial. This was never improvised. It was architected. 12 years. Preston had been planning this for 12 years, since before Ronan was born. How long had he been lying? Had any moment of our relationship been genuine? Sterling closed the dossier and met my eyes with the same intensity I'd seen in intelligence officers before critical operations. He'll run Friday night right after the board votes, Sterling said. Asset transfer approved money wired offshore. Marcus Bellamy boards a plane. The son who wasn't blood, who'd married under false pretenses, who'd stolen millions he never intended to stay. I sat in that diner booth processing the complete picture. Preston had built a 12-year con, married Celeste, raised Ronan as leverage, planted Farah as CFO, created shell companies, forged my reputation into criminal currency, booked an escape before Vera even got sick. And now he was 48 hours from executing the final stage. "That's Friday's board meeting," I said. "Morrison and Caldwell. If I can convince them to vote against the succession transfers." "Preston doesn't get legal authorization," Sterling finished. "Can't wire the money, can't run clean. The whole plan collapses." I had 48 hours to stop a 12-year conspiracy. The war was no longer theoretical. It was tactical, immediate, and the battlefield was Friday's boardroom. Sterling parked 3 blocks from Celeste's apartment building, killing the headlights before the engine stopped ticking. Rain drummed against the windshield in rhythm with my pulse. 72 hours ago, I'd believed my daughter was Preston's victim, another casualty of his 12-year fraud. Now, I was testing a darker hypothesis, that Celeste had chosen him knowingly, that the woman I'd raised had become someone I no longer recognized. Package delivered to subject's residence. Sterling's voice crackled through my earpiece. "She's home, lights on 3rd floor." I adjusted the binoculars, bringing Celeste's living room window into focus. 42 years old, brilliant enough to run corporate healthcare networks. Her mother's eyes, my stubborn chin. The DNA results in that anonymous package proved Preston wasn't Ronan's biological father, which meant Celeste had either been deceived about her husband's identity or was complicit in a multi-generational conspiracy. This surveillance would answer which. "Movement at the door," Sterling murmured. "She's retrieving the package." Through the rain-streaked window, I watched Celeste carry the unmarked envelope to her dining table. No return address, no courier identification, just the evidence that would either save her or condemn her. DNA results showing 0 paternal relationship between Preston and Ronan. Shell company and corporation documents with Farrakemp's digital footprint. Bank transfers totaling $4.5 million. The frozen pension transfer log, time-stamped Saturday night. Everything Preston had stolen, everything he'd built his counterfeit life upon. Celeste opened the envelope with a letter opener, her movements precise and unhurried. She extracted the first document, the genetics report, and began reading. "She's opening it," Sterling said, taking out the first document. "DNA results." I held my breath. This was the moment that would define whether I still had a daughter or had lost her to Preston's manipulation years ago. If she called me, called anyone, sought help, understanding what these documents meant, but Celeste didn't reach for her phone. She read the DNA analysis with the same methodical focus I'd seen her apply to corporate budgets. No gasping shock, no horrified realization. Just clinical assessment turning pages with steady hands while rain pounded the surveillance vehicle's roof. 5 minutes became 10. 10 became 20. "She's reading everything," Sterling observed. "Hasn't picked up her phone once." That professional detachment, was it shock or something more calculated? I'd spent 40 years building Grover Defense Logistics into something that mattered, something that would outlive me and provide for the family I'd treasured above all else. But what good was a legacy when the people you'd built it for were actively trying to tear it down? Oh, before we watch what happens next, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now with your honest prediction, Celeste calls, if you think she'll contact her father, or Celeste burns, if you think she's already chosen Preston's side. No judgment either way. I just want to see how good you are at reading people before the choice gets made. This is fictionalized content for entertainment purposes. Celeste set down the final document, the Cayman Islands flight itinerary, showing Preston had booked his escape ticket before Vera's cancer diagnosis. She stacked all the papers into a neat pile, aligned the edges with precision. Then she stood and walked to the fireplace. "No," I whispered. "Celeste, no." "General, she's moving to the fireplace. She has the entire stack." My daughter knelt before the gas fireplace, the evidence of Preston's 12-year fraud held loosely in her right hand. Through the binoculars, I could see her face clearly, no tears, no anguish, no conflict at all. Just the calm determination of someone who'd already made her choice long before this anonymous package arrived. She turned the gas valve. Flames bloomed blue and orange. "Christ," Sterling breathed. "She's burning it. All of it." The DNA results went first. The laboratory proof that Preston had built his entire relationship with my family on biological lies. Then the passport photographs showing Marcus Bellamy's face beneath Preston Vaughn's features. The Shell Company records. the bank transfers, every piece of evidence I'd spent a week assembling. Celeste fed it all to the flames with the methodical efficiency of someone destroying incriminating files. No phone calls, no confrontations, no moment of horrified realization that the man she married was a sophisticated con artist who'd defrauded her family of millions. Just fire and smoke and the systematic erasure of truth. She knows, I said quietly. She knows everything, and she's choosing him anyway. Sterling lowered his camera, the long lens catching streetlight as he turned toward me. Want me to intervene? We could. No. I kept the binoculars trained on Celeste's window, watching evidence burn like childhood photographs consumed by flames, watching everything I thought I knew about my daughter transform into ash and memory. This is her choice. She's making it with full knowledge. The last document curled and blackened. Celeste stood, brushed soot from her hands, and returned to the dining table where the empty envelope lay. She picked it up, examined it for any identifying marks, found none. Then she smiled. Not relief, not anxiety, not the confused fear of someone who'd just learned terrible truths about the man she loved. Just satisfaction, the expression of someone whose gamble had paid off, whose partnership remained secure, whose secrets had stayed buried. Celeste wasn't Preston's victim. She was his accomplice. We're done here, I told Sterling, setting down the binoculars before my shaking hands betrayed how completely this surveillance had shattered me. Take me home. What about the board vote Preston's escape plan? You still have 48 hours to... I know the timeline. Rain hammered harder against the windshield. But I needed to know whether I was fighting to save my daughter or fighting against her. Now I have my answer. Sterling started the engine, pulling away from the curb, while Celeste's third-floor windows glowed warm and golden behind us. Somewhere in that apartment, my daughter was probably calling Preston right now, warning him that someone knew about Marcus Bellamy and the Cayman accounts. I'd sent that package hoping to save her. Instead, I'd just taught her exactly how much I knew, and given Preston 48 hours to adjust his conspiracy accordingly. Conrad Sterling's call came at 9:17 p.m. 3 words that changed everything. Farah flipped first. I set down the whiskey glass I'd been nursing since returning from the surveillance of Celeste's apartment, the amber liquid untouched and warming. Through the temporary rentals window, Chicago's skyline glittered with the indifference of a city that didn't care whose empires rose or fell. I'd say that again, I said. My FBI contact just called. Farah Kemp walked into the field office an hour ago. Sterling's voice carried the clipped precision of someone delivering intelligence under time pressure. 9 p.m. exactly. Turning herself in, turning Preston in. She brought recordings. I moved to the window, pressing my palm against the cold glass. 48 hours ago, I'd been a disgraced CEO watching my company slip away. 24 hours ago, I'd discovered Preston planned to flee the country. 2 hours ago, I'd watched my daughter choose my enemy over me. Now, Preston's CFO partner had walked into federal custody voluntarily. The conspiracy was fracturing. What triggered it? I asked. Preston avoided her calls for 3 days, Sterling said. She got nervous, searched his office tonight, found the Marcus Bellamy passport in his desk drawer and the Cayman Islands ticket. One way, one ticket, no reservation for her. Sterling paused and I heard papers rustling on his end. She realized he was leaving her holding the bag. Chief financial officer of the shell company's signature on every fraudulent transfer, while Preston disappeared with a new identity and $4.5 million. The entry twist landed with perfect clarity. Preston had built his conspiracy on partnership with Farah, but greed made him plan a solo exit. And Farah, brilliant, ruthless Farah, who'd helped orchestrate 12 years of theft, had figured it out just in time to save herself. She's furious, Sterling continued. According to my contact, she walked in with a USB drive and asked for the agent in charge of white-collar crimes, Agent Miller. Miller is still debriefing her, Sterling said. But here's what matters. She recorded everything. Every meeting, every planning session, 18 months of audio. Miller recognized it as the cleanest evidence package he'd seen in 15 years. 18 months. Farah had been recording since the conspiracy's middle stages, long before Preston decided to abandon her, which meant she'd been planning her own exit strategy while helping Preston execute his. Greed is a solvent that dissolves loyalty. Preston and Farah's partnership, built on theft, collapsed the moment one partner realized the other had planned betrayal first. I'd watched it happen before, in military intelligence criminal conspiracies that fractured not from external pressure, but from the mutual distrust that inevitably consumed people who'd proven themselves capable of treachery. They'd stolen from me together. Now they'd destroy each other. "What's the deal?" I asked. Sterling's voice carried grim satisfaction. 5 years probation versus 20 in federal prison. Forfeit all stolen assets, testify against Preston, full cooperation with ongoing investigation. She took it. Signed cooperation agreement an hour ago. She's their witness now. I walked to the kitchen, running cold water over my hands, letting the temperature shock ground me in the moment. The metallic taste of adrenaline coated my mouth, the same biochemical response I'd felt during combat operations, the body preparing for confrontation, even when the mind knew the battle was already won. "Audio quality?" I asked. "Crystal clear, according to Miller. Farah used professional recording equipment, not phone apps. Time-stamped, backed up to cloud storage, organized by date and topic." Sterling laughed without humor. She kept better records than most prosecutors. Because Farah had always known this moment might come. She'd recorded Preston not out of paranoia, but out of professional insurance, the same calculating mindset that had made her an effective CFO for legitimate businesses before Preston recruited her into fraud. She'd documented everything because documentation was leverage, and leverage was survival. "The recordings cover the DNA fraud?" I asked. "Everything. Preston discussing how to maintain the fake paternity claim, planning what to do if you ever requested genetic testing, coordinating with Farah on how to structure shell companies to hide the theft." Miller said, one recording has Preston explicitly stating he's not Ronan's biological father and laughing about it. I gripped the edge of the sink, knuckles whitening. Preston had laughed. Laughed about deceiving a 19-year-old college student, about poisoning a family, about building 12 years of lies on a foundation of biological fraud. "Does Preston know?" I asked. "Not yet. FBI wants him unaware until arrest warrant executes. Miller's drafting the warrant now, should have judicial signature by midnight." "When?" "Tomorrow morning, before he can run." Sterling paused. "Miller asked if you want to be present." Through the window, the city's lights blurred slightly, fatigue, or perhaps the whiskey fumes from the abandoned glass. How fitting that Preston, who'd built his conspiracy on deception, would be destroyed by the very partner he'd planned to abandon, the student of fraud devoured by his own curriculum. "Tell Miller yes," I said. "I want to watch." 7 a.m., Grover Defense Logistics Headquarters. They'll arrest him in his office. Sterling ended the call, and I stood in the darkness of my temporary apartment, processing the irony Preston had orchestrated of a conspiracy to steal my company, only to have his partner record every word and hand it to the FBI the moment she realized she was expendable. Tomorrow morning, federal agents would arrest him, and he had no idea his empire had already collapsed. Somewhere across the city, Preston slept in whatever bed he'd chosen for the night, believing his conspiracy remained intact, believing Friday's board meeting would complete his theft, believing Farah Kemp was still his loyal partner in fraud. He would wake to federal agents and audio recordings, and 18 months of his own voice confessing to everything. I picked up the whiskey glass, finally taking a sip. It had gone warm and harsh, but I drank it anyway, tasting oak and smoke, and the bitter satisfaction of watching an enemy's fortress crumble from within. Preston slid the succession documents across the boardroom table at 9:05 a.m. and said the words that would destroy him. "Sign it, old man. Even Vera would have wanted you to accept reality." I'd slept 3 hours after Sterling's call about Farah's FBI cooperation. Then, dressed in the charcoal suit Vera had chosen for our 40th anniversary dinner, the one she'd said made me look like the man she'd married, strong enough to build empires, wise enough to know when to fight. This morning, I would need both. The boardroom smelled of leather and old money mahogany and the faint residue of expensive cologne. 8 board members sat along the perimeter, witnesses to what Preston believed would be my surrender. Celeste stood near the windows, her face unreadable. Farah Kemp stood beside Preston's right shoulder, her usual confidence replaced by something that looked like nausea. She knew what was coming. "The board has confirmed the transition," Preston said, his voice carrying the smug certainty of someone who thought he'd already won. "All you need to do is sign." I looked at the documents. Transfer of company control asset authority, operational leadership, everything Vera and I had built across 4 decades reduced to 3 signature lines and a notary seal. And if I refused, I asked. Preston leaned back in the chair that had been mine for 20 years, his expression mixing pity and contempt in equal measure. Then you prove you never cared about this company or Vera's legacy. The entry twist landed like a slap. Preston invoking my dead wife's memory as a weapon, using the woman who'd spent 40 years building Grover Defense Logistics as leverage to steal it. The insult hung in the air, toxic and unforgivable. Vera spent 40 years building this company alongside you. Preston continued his tone, suggesting sympathy he didn't feel. She'd want stability, not your ego destroying what she created. Don't you dare speak for her. My voice came out quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded violence in my military days. Celeste flinched near the window, but stayed silent. My daughter, who'd watched Preston orchestrate this theft, who'd chosen him over me, who'd burned evidence rather than seek truth, stood mute while her husband desecrated her mother's memory. She's gone, Preston said flatly. I'm what's left. Sign the documents. I picked up the gold fountain pen lying beside the succession papers. Vera's gift on our 40th wedding anniversary, 3 months before the cancer diagnosis. The inscription along the barrel read, 40 years of truth. Her acknowledgement that we'd built everything on honest contracts and honorable deals, even when deception would have been more profitable. That gold pen had witnessed every significant contract of my career, every partnership agreement, every acquisition, every promise that carried the weight of my word and Vera's trust. I would not let it sign the greatest lie of my life. I raised the pen above the documents. The entire boardroom held its breath, Preston leaning forward with anticipation, Farah going pale, Celeste's reflection in the window, showing something that might have been shame. I dropped the pen. It clattered against the mahogany table, the sound echoing in the silence like a judge's gavel. No, I said. Preston's face darkened. You're making a mistake. This pen, Vera gave it to me for 40 years of building something that mattered. She'd never forgive me for signing it away to someone who uses her memory as a weapon. You stubborn... The boardroom doors opened. FBI Special Agent Miller entered first, his credentials already raised, followed by 4 federal agents in tactical gear. The morning light caught the metal of their badges, turning them into small suns of authority that made Preston's stolen power look like candlelight before dawn. FBI, Miller announced. Nobody move. Farah's face drained of all remaining color. She'd known this was coming. She'd triggered it by walking into that field office last night, but watching it happen clearly carried a different weight than imagining it. Preston stood slowly, confusion replacing arrogance. What is this? Preston Vaughn, we have questions about financial irregularities at this company. Miller's voice carried the flat authority of someone who'd conducted 1,000 interrogations and knew exactly which questions would destroy which lies. This is insane, Preston said, but his eyes were already darting toward the exits, calculating distances, measuring whether the Marcus Bellamy passport hidden in his apartment safe could still save him. It couldn't. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew a sealed envelope. The genetics laboratory logo was visible through the manila paper. Gentech Diagnostics, the same firm that had processed paternity tests for 3 generations of custody cases. I slid it across the table toward Preston. Open it, I said quietly. Read the final line. Preston's hands shook as he tore the envelope. I watched him scan the document, the methodology section, the sample collection dates, the laboratory certification, before his eyes reached the conclusion that would end him. Probability of biological relationship between subject A and subject B, 0.00%. Preston read aloud, his voice losing strength with each word. The Marcus Bellamy passport photo flashed through my mind. Preston had planned to abandon everyone, including the son, who wasn't even his, leaving Celeste and a 19-year-old college student to face the consequences of fraud he'd orchestrated. Preston looked at Farah, searching for support or explanation, or perhaps just confirmation that this was happening. She met his gaze for exactly 1 second before looking away, and in that moment of averted eyes, Preston understood the complete scope of his collapse. This doesn't prove anything about the company, Preston said weakly. Miller stepped forward, pulling a USB drive from his pocket. Actually, we have recordings, 18 months of them. Every meeting, every fraudulent transaction, every dollar you stole. Your CFO was very thorough. Preston's eyes went wide. You? Farah said nothing. just stood there with her arms wrapped around herself, the taste of betrayal metallic in the boardroom air, watching the partner she'd conspired with for years, realize she'd been documenting everything. The arrogance that had carried Preston through Vera's funeral, through the lockout, through every stolen dollar it drained from his face like water through a sieve, replaced by pure animal fear. The man who demanded my signature 5 minutes ago now looked like someone watching his escape routes collapse in real time. Miller pulled handcuffs from his belt. Preston Vaughn, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, theft, forgery, and violation of fiduciary duty. You have the right to remain silent. I watched federal agents surround the man who'd stolen my company, weaponized my wife's memory, and poisoned my family, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction as justice finally arrived. Celeste stood at 9:20 a.m., her voice cutting through the chaos of Preston's arrest. Preston may have no claim, but I'm the biological daughter. My inheritance rights are absolute. The federal agents had Preston in handcuffs, with Agent Miller reading Miranda rights in the monotone of someone who delivered them 1,000 times. But Celeste's declaration stopped everyone mid-movement, her words hanging in the boardroom air like smoke after gunfire. She stepped forward from her position by the windows, her hospital administrator composure reasserting itself. I am the biological daughter. Whatever Preston did, my rights remain. Celeste. I kept my voice level, the same tone I'd used when she was 5, and reaching for something that would burn her. Sit down. No. Her chin lifted my stubborn chin, or so I'd always thought. I won't let you erase me because of his crimes. I reached into my suit jacket's inner pocket fingers, finding the envelope I'd carried for 28 years. Yellowed legal paper sealed in plastic to preserve what time would otherwise destroy. The document I'd hoped I'd never need to use as a weapon. What is that? Celeste asked her, certainty wavering. I slid it across the boardroom table, watching her face as she recognized the official seal of Cook County Family Court. Your adoption papers, Celeste. You've never been our biological daughter. The entry twist detonated in silence. No explosion, no dramatic music, just the sound of Celeste's breathing, changing, becoming shallow and rapid, the physiological response to a world ending. She picked up the document with trembling hands. I watched her read the header, Final Decree of Adoption, and the date, August 15th, 1997. 28 years ago, when Vera and I had held a 3-month-old infant and signed papers that made her legally ours. 28 years, Celeste whispered. You never told me. Vera wanted you to grow up knowing only love, not questions. The words came out harder than I intended. She believed family was what you built, not what biology dictated. Celeste kept reading, her eyes scanning details she'd never known existed. Biological parents unknown, parental rights, terminated legal guardianship, transferred. The architecture of her entire identity, revealed as constructed rather than inherited. My entire life, she said, her voice cracking. I believed I was... You were our daughter, I said. That was never a lie. But the bloodline Vera's will requires biological descent, which you're not. I let that sink in, watching comprehension destroy what remained of her certainty. You have no legal claim to the company. You never did. I remembered holding infant Celeste for the first time, Vera crying with joy beside me in that hospital room. We'd loved her as our daughter for 28 years, and biology had never mattered, not when she took her first steps, not when she graduated medical school, not when she chose a career saving lives instead of running the company I'd built. Blood had been irrelevant until this moment, when it became the weapon that proved she'd sacrificed everything for nothing. Celeste set down the adoption papers, her hands still shaking. She looked at Preston, who stood in handcuffs between 2 federal agents, and something like desperate hope flickered across her face. Preston, she said quietly, we're still... Preston laughed. Not the polite social laugh he'd deployed at board meetings and charity galas, but something cold and genuine. The exit twist arrived in the form of pure contempt. Well, that's convenient, Preston said, his tone carrying the casual cruelty of someone discarding a broken tool. The woman I was going to marry turns out to be nobody. Celeste flinched as if struck. Preston, we're still family. Almost. He shook his head, smiling despite the handcuffs. You're not family. You were never family. You were access, legitimacy, window dressing to make the inheritance claim look cleaner. He paused, letting the words cut deeper. And now you're worthless. The boardroom had gone silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights, and someone's ragged breathing might have been. Celeste might have been me. Preston's mask had finally dropped completely, revealing not the sophisticated fraudster or the grieving stepson, but something simpler and uglier, a con artist discarding a prop that no longer served its purpose. "I burned the evidence for you," Celeste said, her voice barely audible. "The package, the DNA, results, the passport photos, everything. I burned it all." Preston shrugged, the gesture limited by handcuffs. "I didn't ask you to. That was your choice." She turned to me, and I saw the moment she understood the complete scope of her isolation. "You tested me, the anonymous package. You wanted to see if I could be saved." "I needed to know," I said quietly, "whether you were his victim or his accomplice. And I chose wrong." Tears finally broke through her composure, tracking mascara down her cheeks. "I chose him over truth, over you, over everything real." Watching Celeste crumble was like watching a building demolition, 28 years of carefully constructed identity collapsing floor by floor, leaving only rubble and the question of what had been real. The confident hospital administrator, the dutiful daughter, the woman who'd believed her bloodline gave her rights, all of it disintegrating under the weight of revealed truth. "And now I have nothing," Celeste whispered. "No biological family, no inheritance, no Preston." She looked at me with something that might have been pleading. "No father who trusts me." I wanted to tell her that trust could be rebuilt, that families survived worse betrayals, that love didn't require shared DNA. But those words would have been lies, and I'd spent enough of my life surrounded by deception. "You made your choices," I said instead. "Now you live with them." Miller cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "We need to process the suspect. Mr. Vaughn, if you'll excuse us." Celeste sank into the nearest chair, adoption papers still clutched in her shaking hands, while Preston turned his back on her as if she'd never existed. I'd exposed Preston's fraud and reclaimed my company, but the cost was measured in the broken woman still staring at adoption papers, learning that everything she'd believed about herself had been constructed on silence and good intentions. Justice apparently didn't care about collateral damage. Saskia Winsleet stepped to the boardroom console at 9:30 a.m., entered the authorization code I'd given her 48 hours earlier, and the massive presentation screen blazed to life with every crime Preston and Farah had committed. Celeste remained collapsed in her chair, adoption papers clutched like a lifeline to an identity that no longer existed. Preston stood in handcuffs between federal agents, his expression shifting from contempt to confusion as the 12-foot LED display illuminated the boardroom with documentary evidence. Authorization code accepted. Saskia announced, her voice carrying none of the nervous deference she'd shown Preston for the past week. Displaying financial audit evidence. The entry twist materialized in spreadsheet format. Saskia's double agent work, her seemingly loyal assistance to Preston's conspiracy, had been gathering documentation the entire time. Every file she'd accessed for him, she'd copied for me. Every meeting she'd scheduled, she'd documented. The woman Preston had trusted as his inside operative had been mine all along. "Oh, what is this?" Preston demanded, straining against the handcuffs. "Everything," I said quietly. "Every crime, every theft, every lie." The first slide displayed 4 Delaware Shell Company and Corporation documents dated across 18 months. Global Freight Solutions, Apex Logistics Consulting, Horizon Management, Partners Zenith Supply Chain Associates, each listing Farah Kemp as registered agent, each using variations of Grover Defense Logistics business address to create false legitimacy. Miller stepped closer to the screen, reading details aloud for the record. 4 shell companies, 18 months of systematic theft, forged federal defense contractor signatures to establish credibility with financial institutions. "You can't prove Preston started. We have audio recordings of every planning meeting," Miller interrupted. "Every single one." Ms. Kemp was very thorough. The next slide showed wire transfer records. I watched the numbers scroll past. Pension fund withdrawals disguised as vendor payments routed through the shell companies, consolidated in Cayman accounts. The theft hadn't been a single dramatic heist, but death by 1,000 cuts. Each transaction small enough to avoid immediate scrutiny, large enough to compound into financial devastation. The boardroom smelled of coffee gone cold, and fear sweat the air conditioning, unable to mask the physiological reality of people watching their world collapse. 8 board members sat frozen witnessing corporate fraud, documented with the precision of a surgical dissection. Ms. Kemp contacted the FBI on October 23rd at 9 p.m., Miller said, consulting his notes. She's been cooperating for 36 hours under a preliminary immunity agreement. Preston turned to Farah with pure rage. You recorded me everything. Farah finally met his eyes, her expression mixing defiance and resignation. You were leaving me behind. The Marcus Bellamy passport, 1 ticket, no reservation for me. Did you really think I wouldn't notice? We were partners, Preston hissed. You made me the CFO of record for every shell company. Every forged signature had my name attached. Farah's voice hardened. I was the scapegoat. You planned to disappear and let me face federal prison alone. The visual shock arrived in high definition. The boardroom screen showed the complete financial picture stolen, pension funds traced through 4 shell companies, each transaction time-stamped, each forgery cataloged. 40 years of honorable service nearly destroyed, reduced to spreadsheet format, and displayed in clinical detail. The numbers glowed against the dark screen, like evidence at a crime scene, each cell a small indictment. So you turned first, Preston said bitterly. Destroyed both of us to save yourself. I turned because you were going to abandon me, Farah shot back. I just did it before you could. I want my lawyer, Preston said, the arrogance finally draining completely. You'll get your call. Miller turned to Farah, his expression professionally neutral. Farah Kemp, despite your cooperation agreement, you're also under arrest. Your charges are similar, though the prosecution will consider your cooperation during sentencing recommendations. Farah's face went pale. You said immunity, preliminary immunity pending full cooperation and testimony, Miller corrected. You still committed federal crimes. The agreement reduces your exposure, but you're not walking away clean. The exit twist arrived with poetic symmetry. Both conspirators arrested together, partners in crime becoming partners in handcuffs. Farah had betrayed Preston to save herself, but justice didn't care about the sequence of betrayals, only the crimes they had committed together. 2 federal agents stepped forward, 1 to each conspirator. The sound of steel handcuffs, Preston's wrists already restrained. Farah's hands pulled behind her back, echoed through the silent boardroom. Click! The handcuffs closed on Preston's wrists with the same finality as Vera's casket lid, ending the conspiracy that had started before her final breath. That sound metal against metal mechanisms locking freedom ending carried more weight than any judge's gavel. Click! Farah's handcuffs secured, and she closed her eyes, the reality of federal prosecution replacing whatever freedom she'd imagined her cooperation would purchase. Oh, watch your head, an agent said, guiding Preston toward the boardroom doors. Preston stopped, turning back to look at me one final time. This isn't over. Yes, I said quietly, it is. I'd won. Exposed the conspiracy, reclaimed my company, watched federal agents arrest the people who'd stolen from me. But the boardroom felt like a battlefield. After the shooting stopped, bodies still warm, smoke still clearing the cost of victory written in blood and broken family. Saskia powered down the presentation screen, the evidence disappearing into darkness. The board members sat in stunned silence. Celeste remained slumped in her chair, adoption papers still trembling in her hands, a casualty of truth as much as conspiracy. The boardroom doors closed behind the FBI agents Preston and Farah, disappearing into the hallway in handcuffs. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy Grover Defense Logistics ended not with a negotiation or settlement, but with steel restraints and federal charges. Justice had been served, the company secured, the criminals were removed. I stood alone in the silent boardroom, surrounded by wreckage of a family that could never be rebuilt, and wondered if winning was supposed to feel this empty. I found Celeste sitting in the corporate hallway, an hour after the arrest's adoption papers, still clutched in her hand, and knew I had one final duty to perform, not for her, but for Vera's memory. She hadn't moved from where she'd collapsed. Mascara tracked down her cheeks in dried rivers. Hospital administrator composure shattered completely. 28 years of assumed identity destroyed in a single document dated 1997. I don't know who I am anymore, she said without looking up. I stood above her, tasting the bitterness of coffee I'd forced down in my office, the acid burning my throat the way this conversation would burn whatever remained between us. You're the daughter Vera loved for 28 years, but not yours. She finally met my eyes. Never yours, not by blood, Blood didn't matter to Vera, I said. It shouldn't have mattered to you. Then why does it matter now? Her voice cracked. Why did you use it as a weapon? I pulled an envelope from my jacket pocket, thick manila sealed, weighted with cash and obligation, set it on the floor beside her. 6 months' rent and legal fees. This isn't because I forgive you. Celeste stared at the envelope. Then why? Because your mother would want me to. That's the only reason. The entry twist settled like dust after demolition. This mercy wasn't for Celeste, wasn't forgiveness or reconciliation. It was the final duty I owed Vera's memory. Extending grace not because it was deserved, but because the woman I'd loved for 40 years would have demanded it. After 6 months, you're on your own. I burned evidence for him, Celeste whispered. I chose him over you, over truth, over everything. Yes, I said simply. You did. The hallway smelled of industrial carpet cleaner and the ghost of old coffee, the scent of corporate spaces after violence passes through. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, indifferent to the wreckage of families, the destruction of trust, the price of choosing wrong. I turned and walked away down the hallway without looking back. If I'd turned, I would have seen not the 28-year-old woman who'd burned evidence to protect a criminal. I would have seen the 3-year-old Vera held at the zoo, pointing at elephants laughing with pure joy before the world taught her to choose lies over truth. I couldn't afford that weakness. The company needed me clear-headed, and mercy had its limits. The elevator doors closed on Celeste's image, and I let myself feel nothing. 3 p.m. brought an unexpected knock on my office door. Saskia opened it cautiously, her expression uncertain. Sir, you have a visitor. Ronan is here. The 19-year-old young man, who had just learned the man he called father, was led away in handcuffs, stood in the doorway. His frame was shaking the heavy weight of his world, collapsing visible in his posture. Grandpa Ronan said quietly, and the word hit me like shrapnel unearned yet weighted with 19 years of shared memories. I just found out what he did. I'm so sorry. I had no idea about the money or the DNA or any of it. I stood up from my desk, walking over to face the young man. He was tall now, inheriting his biological mother's features, but his eyes held the same fear as when he was a child terrified of the dark. You didn't do anything wrong, Ronan. You are a victim of his design. But the company, my whole life, was a lie built on his fraud. Ronan's voice cracked, his hands clenched into fists. I don't even know whose son I am anymore. I looked at this young man. He had no blood relation to me, no legal claim to the Grover Empire, but he was the boy who asked me about military honor, who genuinely grieved for Vera when she passed, while his biological parents calculated their theft. Ronan, I said, carefully placing a hand on his shoulder, your tuition at Northwestern is paid in full. Your trust fund from your grandmother Vera remains untouched because it was set up in your name, not Preston's. You finish your degree. You make your own way clean and untainted by his shadow. The exit twist arrived in the form of a young man's restored hope, despite no blood relation. Despite his father's federal crimes, I was offering him a path to clear his name and build a real future. Can I still call you Grandpa? Ronan asked, his eyes wet. Ronan met my grip with a firm, steady handshake, a silent contract between an old general and a young man deciding who he wanted to become. I watched him leave my office, his head held a little higher. He was different from Preston. He was different from Celeste. Maybe blood didn't matter as much as I'd thought. Maybe one good choice could break a generational cycle of betrayal. The family I'd built was destroyed. Vera was gone. Celeste had chosen lies. Preston was in federal custody. But watching that boy walk down the hallway, I saw something I hadn't expected to find in the wreckage, a small piece of hope that the future might be different than the past. Ronan's handshake still lingered in memory, that small promise of redemption. But this morning wasn't about future hope. It was about present accountability to the men and women who'd stayed loyal while my family fractured. The auditorium smelled of coffee and industrial cleaner. Assembly workers in company uniforms sat beside engineers and business casual accountants who'd worked through Preston's brief control, now watching with cautious expectation. Some had been here since Vera and I founded the company. I gripped the podium, tasting copper anxiety. No notes, no prepared speech, just truth. The $4.5 million stolen from your pension funds has been fully recovered, I said. Nobody lost a penny. The entry twist arrived in complete restoration. Every dollar Preston and Farah had stolen traced through shell companies seized by prosecutors, returned to the pension accounts of 200 people who'd built defense equipment with integrity. Ethical leadership vindicated through protected retirement funds. Silence held for 3 seconds, then someone stood and started clapping. The applause spread like fire assembly. Workers, engineers, accountants rising to their feet, the sound echoing until it felt like thunder. I raised my hand for quiet. "What about the people Preston fired?" Someone shouted. "Every loyal employee who was terminated is invited back," I said, "at higher salaries. HR will contact each person individually." More applause, louder this time. "You built this company with your hands and your integrity," I continued. "That's worth more than any theft could destroy. Defense contracts are being honored. Production continues because you stayed when others would have run." An older man near the front assembly supervisor for 30 years stood with tears on his weathered face. "Thank you, General. The employees who'd stayed when Preston offered bribes to leave, who'd worked through lockouts and threats, they stood in that auditorium, not because I'd paid them well, but because 40 years of keeping my word had earned something money couldn't buy trust. That currency invisible on any balance sheet had proven more valuable than stolen millions." "Get back to work," I said. "We have defense contracts to honor." They filed out slowly, some stopping to shake my hand. Within 20 minutes, the auditorium was empty, except for echoes and humming fluorescent lights. Purpose restored, mission continuing. 6 weeks later, December wind cut across Chicago as I climbed the Dirksen Federal Building steps. Cold air off Lake Michigan carried the smell of coming snow, metallic and sharp, my breath fogged in the morning chill. Federal courthouse security metal detectors, the institutional smell of marble and old wood. Courtroom 2, 106, 10th floor, Judge Margaret Holbrook presiding. I entered quietly, taking a seat in the regular gallery area. Not the family section, not reserved seating for victims or relatives. The exit twist materialized in that choice deliberate positioning as citizen, rather than father witness, rather than family severing ties that biology had never actually created. Preston had never been my son. I would watch his sentencing as what I'd always been, the man he'd tried to destroy. Judge Margaret Holbrook, 62, entered with the measured authority of 20 years on the bench. She'd seen white-collar criminals promise reform before, and her face suggested appropriate skepticism. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Preston had lost weight arrogance finally burned away by Cook County Jail. Farah stood separately, her cooperation agreement having bought her a different sentence. Agent Miller sat at the prosecution table, files organized with FBI precision. "Preston Vaughn," Judge Holbrook said, "you are hereby sentenced to 12 years in federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy to commit federal crimes, and forgery of defense contractor documents." Preston's shoulders slumped. "This isn't—" "You're finished speaking, Mr. Vaughn," Holbrook interrupted. "Oh, Farah Kemp, pursuant to your cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors, you are sentenced to 5 years supervised probation and forfeiture of all stolen assets. Violation of probation terms will result in immediate incarceration." Farah nodded, mutely cooperation, having bought freedom but not redemption. U.S. Marshals approached Preston, hands on his shoulders, guiding him toward the side door that led to holding cells and prison transport. He didn't look at me, didn't look back, just shuffled forward in shackles that clinked with each step. "Let's go, Vaughn," the marshal said. Miller approached my seat as the courtroom cleared. "Justice served General." No, I said quietly. "Justice executed. There's a difference." He nodded, understanding satisfaction required emotional investment. And I'd spent that currency months ago. This was just completion, the legal system doing its job, criminals receiving sentences, accountability grinding to its inevitable conclusion. I stood, put on my coat, and walked out alone. The December wind cut through my coat as I descended the steps, sharp, clean, honest, the kind of cold that reminded you winter always comes, but doesn't apologize for doing its job. Chicago continued around me. Traffic on Dearborn, pedestrians bundled against cold, the city indifferent to federal sentencing and family destruction. Nothing left to do. Companies secure employees, protected criminals imprisoned, pension funds restored. One small boy promised college tuition 13 years from now. Vera's grave visited every Sunday with fresh flowers. I reached my car in the courthouse parking lot and sat for a moment before starting the engine, looking at the gray December sky over Chicago. Preston would serve 12 years in federal prison. Farah would spend 5 years looking over her shoulder. Celeste would rebuild an identity from ashes. Ronan would grow up without the father, who'd never been his biological parent anyway. And I would continue, not because there was anything left to win, but because 40 years of service had taught me that honor isn't about victory. It's about what you do when everything else is taken away. I started the engine and drove toward home. I signed the last document at dawn on the Grover Defense Logistics rooftop. Chicago spread beneath me in late December, cold, and finally understood what Vera had been trying to tell me for 40 years. 2 papers sat on the folding table Dashiell had carried up from the executive suite. Simple documents, permanent consequences. The first, an employee stock ownership plan, transferring 50% of Grover Defense Logistics to the 200 workers who'd kept this company breathing while my family tried to suffocate it. Assembly workers, warehouse managers, logistics coordinators. People who had earned ownership not through blood or marriage, but through showing up every single day when leaving would have been easier. I signed with the gold pen. Vera's inscription along the barrel. 40 years of truth caught the pale winter light. "You're certain?" Dashiell asked. "I built this with them," I said. "Not alone." The second document, the Vera Grover Scholarship Fund, endowed with $30 million from reserves we'd accumulated quietly across 4 decades. Full scholarships for students pursuing engineering, military service, or public service. Her name on every acceptance letter, her values in every recipient. Not my name, hers. Dashiell witnessed both signatures without further comment. He understood as lawyers sometimes do when words would cost more than silence. I left him on the rooftop and drove to Lake Forest. The house was exactly as I'd left it that October morning, when Preston whispered into his phone and a war began. Same granite countertops, same bay window, same coffee maker Vera had programmed every night for 15 years, the habit so ingrained I'd never reprogrammed it myself. I stood at the kitchen sink with a single cup of coffee watching winter light move across bare trees in the garden she'd planted. Preston would serve his sentence, Farah would serve hers. Celeste would rebuild herself from whatever remained after the truth burned everything constructed on lies. Ronan would finish his degree and make choices that were finally completely his own. The company was secure, the employees were protected, the scholarship fund was established. I had nothing left to fight for, which meant for the first time in 3 months, I had space for something else entirely. I raised the coffee cup toward the window, a private gesture, no witnesses needed. I kept it, I told her silently, everything that mattered. The December light came through the glass the way she'd always loved it, straight and clean and honest. That was enough. And to you listening to my story, remember this family is not defined by blood, but by loyalty and honor. I spent 40 years building a company and a family, believing that love and trust were enough. I was wrong to keep Celeste's adoption secret for 28 years. I was wrong to assume blood didn't matter, but I was right about one thing. When family betrayal strikes you, discover who you truly are. Not in the victories, but in how you respond when everything you built threatens to collapse. The lesson I learned isn't just about exposing fraud or protecting employees. It's about recognizing that some people choose greed over loyalty no matter what you've given them. Family betrayal cuts deeper than business loss because it shatters trust. But I believe God put me through this to teach me that legacy isn't what you leave to your children, it's what you build for strangers who need a chance. The Vera Grover Scholarship Fund will help kids who understand that honor matters more than inheritance. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment and tell me, would you have handled family betrayal the same way I did or differently? Share this with someone who needs to hear that character matters more than bloodlines. And if you want more stories about standing up for what's right, subscribe to Revenge Dad. Your support means everything to this old man. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Remember, some details in this story have been fictionalized for reflection and learning. What I hope stays with you is the message loyalty, honor, and doing right matter more than any inheritance.